A Dead Finger by Sabin Baring Gould. 1. Why the National Gallery should not attract so many visitors as, say, the British Museum, I cannot explain. The latter does not contain much that one would suppose appeals to the interest of the ordinary sightseer. What knows such of prehistoric flints and scratched bones, or Assyrian sculpture, or Egyptian hieroglyphics? The Greek and Roman statuary is cold and dead. The paintings in the National Gallery glow with colour and are instinct with life. Yet somehow a few listless wanderers saunter yawning through the National Gallery, whereas swarms pour through the halls of the British Museum and talk and pass remarks about the objects there exposed, of the date and meaning of which they have not the faintest conception. I was thinking of this problem, and endeavouring to unravel it, one morning whilst sitting in the room for English masters at the Great Collection in Trafalgar Square. At the same time, another thought forced itself upon me. I had been through the rooms devoted to foreign schools, and had then come into that given over to Reynolds, Morland, Gainsborough, Constable and Hogarth. The morning had been for a while propitious, but towards noon a dense umber-tinted fog had come on, making it all but impossible to see the pictures, and quite impossible to do them justice. I was tired, and so seated myself on one of the chairs, and fell into the consideration, first of all, of why the National Gallery is not as popular as it should be, and secondly, how it was that the British school had no beginnings, like those of Italy and the Netherlands. We can see the art of the painter from its first initiation in the Italian peninsula and among the Flemings. It starts on its progress like a child, and we can trace every stage of its growth. Not so with English art. It springs to life in full and splendid maturity. Who were there before Reynolds and Gainsborough and Hogarth? The great names of those portrait and subject painters who have left their canvases upon the walls of our country houses were those of foreigners: Holbein, Kneller, Van Dyck and Lely for portraits, and Monnoyer for flower and fruit pieces. Landscapes, figure subjects, were all importations, none homegrown. How came that about? Was there no limner that was native? Was it that fashion trampled on homegrown pictorial beginnings as it flouted and spurned native music? Here was food for contemplation, dreaming in the brown fog, looking through it without seeing its beauties at Hogarth's painting of Lavinia Fenton as Polly Peachum, without wondering how so indifferent a beauty could have captivated the Duke of Bolton and held him for 30 years. I was recalled to myself and my surroundings by the strange conduct of a lady who had seated herself on a chair near me, also discouraged by the fog and awaiting its dispersion. I had not noticed her particularly. At the present moment I do not remember particularly what she was like. So far as I can recollect, she was middle-aged and was quietly yet well-dressed. It was not her face nor her dress that attracted my attention and disturbed the current of my thoughts. The effect I speak of was produced by her strange movements and behaviour. She had been sitting listless, probably thinking of nothing at all, or nothing in particular, when, in turning her eyes round and finding that she could see nothing of the paintings, she began to study me. This did concern me greatly. A cat may look at the king, but to be contemplated by a lady is a compliment sufficient to please any gentleman. It was not gratified vanity that troubled my thoughts, but the consciousness that my appearance produced, first of all, a startled surprise, then undisguised alarm, and finally, indescribable horror. Now, a man can sit quietly, leaning on the head of his umbrella, and glow internally, warmed and illumined by the consciousness that he is being surveyed with admiration by a lovely woman, even when he is middle-aged and not fashionably dressed. But no man can maintain his composure when he discovers himself to be an object of aversion and terror. What was it? I passed my hand over my chin and upper lip, thinking it not impossible that I might have forgotten to have shaved that morning, and in my confusion not considering that the fog would prevent the lady from discovering neglect in this particular, had it occurred, which it had not. I am a little careless, perhaps, about shaving when in the country, but when in town, never. The next idea that occurred to me was a smut. Had a London black, curdled in that dense pea soup atmosphere, descended on my nose and blackened it? I hastily drew my silk handkerchief from my pocket, moistened it, and passed it over my nose and then each cheek. I then turned my eyes into the corners and looked at the lady, to see whether by this means I had got rid of what was objectionable in my personal appearance. Then I saw that her eyes, dilated with horror, were riveted not on my face, but on my leg. My leg. What on earth could that harmless member have in it so terrifying? The morning had been dull, there had been rain in the night, and I admit that on leaving my hotel I had turned up the bottoms of my trousers. That is a proceeding not so uncommon, not so outrageous as to account for the stony stare of this woman's eyes. If that were all, I would turn my trousers down. Then I saw her shrink from the chair on which she sat to one further removed from me, but still with her eyes fixed on my leg, about the level of my knee. She had let fall her umbrella and was grasping the seat of her chair with both hands as she backed from me. I need hardly say that I was greatly disturbed in mind and feelings, and forgot all about the origin of the English schools of painters and the question of why the British Museum is more popular than the National Gallery. Thinking that I might have been spattered by a hansom whilst crossing Oxford Street, I passed my hand down my side hastily with a sense of annoyance, and all at once touched something cold, clammy, that sent a thrill to my heart and made me start and take a step forward. At the same moment, the lady, with a cry of horror, sprang to her feet, and with raised hands fled from the room, leaving her umbrella where it had fallen. There were other visitors to the picture gallery besides ourselves, who had been passing through the saloon, and they turned at her cry, and looked in surprise after her. The policeman stationed in the room came to me, and asked what had happened. I was in such agitation that I hardly knew what to answer. I told him that I could explain what had occurred little better than himself. I had noticed that the lady had worn an odd expression, and had behaved in most extraordinary fashion, and that he had best take charge of her umbrella and wait for her to return to claim it. This questioning by the official was vexing, as it prevented me from at once and on the spot investigating the cause of her alarm and mine, hers at something she must have seen on my leg, and mine at something I had distinctly felt creeping up my leg. The numbing and sickening effect of me of the touch of the object I had not seen was not to be shaken off at once. Indeed, I felt as though my hand were contaminated, and that I could have no rest till I had thoroughly washed the hand and, if possible, washed away the feeling that had been produced. I looked on the floor and examined my leg, but saw nothing. As I wore my overcoat, it was probable that in rising from my seat the skirt had fallen over my trousers and hidden the thing, whatever it was. I therefore hastily removed my overcoat and shook it. Then I looked at my trousers. There was nothing whatever on my leg, and nothing fell from my overcoat when shaken. Accordingly, I reinvested myself and hastily left the gallery, then took my way as speedily as I could, without actually running, to Charing Cross Station and down the narrow way leading to the Metropolitan, where I went into Faulkner's bath and hairdressing establishment and asked for hot water to thoroughly wash my hand and well soap it. I bathed my hand in water as hot as I could endure it, employed carbolic soap, And then, after having a good brush down, especially on my left side, where my hand had encountered the object that had so affected me, I left. I had entertained the intention of going to the Princess's Theatre that evening and of securing a ticket in the morning, but all thought of theatre going was gone from me. I could not free my heart from the sense of nausea and cold that had been produced by the touch. I went into Gatti's to have lunch and ordered something, I forget what, but when served, I found that my appetite was gone. I could eat nothing. The food inspired me to disgust. I thrust it from me untasted and, after drinking a couple of glasses of claret, left the restaurant and returned to my hotel. Feeling sick and faint, I threw my overcoat over the sofa back and cast myself on my bed. I do not know that there was any particular reason for my doing so, but as I lay, my eyes were on my greatcoat. The density of the fog had passed away, and there was light again, not of first quality, but sufficient for a Londoner to swear by, so that I could see everything in my room, though through a veil, darkly. I do not think my mind was occupied in any way. About the only occasions on which, to my knowledge, my mind is actually passive or inert is when crossing the channel in the foam from Dover to Calais, when I am always, in every weather, abjectly seasick and thoughtless. But as I now lay on my bed, uncomfortable, squeamish, without knowing why, I was in the same inactive mental condition. But not for long. I saw something that startled me. First, it appeared to me as if the lappet of my overcoat pocket were in movement, being raised. I did not pay much attention to this, as I supposed that the garment was sliding down onto the seat of the sofa from the back, and that this displacement of gravity caused the movement I observed. But this, I soon saw, was not the case. That which moved the lappet was something in the pocket that was struggling to get out. I could see now that it was working its way up the inside, and that when it reached the opening, it lost balance and fell down again. I could make this out by the projections and indentations in the cloth. These moved as the creature, or whatever it was, worked its way up the lining. A mouse, I said, and forgot my seediness. I was interested. The little rascal! However did he contrive to seat himself in my pocket? And I have worn that overcoat all the morning. But no, it was not a mouse. I saw something white poke its way out from under the lappet, and in another moment an object was revealed that, though revealed, I could not understand, nor could I distinguish what it was. Now, roused by curiosity, I raised myself on my elbow. In doing this, I made some noise as the bed creaked. Instantly, the something dropped on the floor, lay outstretched for a moment to recover itself, and then began, with the motions of a maggot, to run along the floor. There is a caterpillar called the measurer because when it advances, it draws its tail up to where its head is and then throws forward its full length and again draws up its extremity, forming at each time a loop, and with each step measuring its total length. The object I now saw on the floor was advancing precisely like the measuring caterpillar. It had the colour of a cheese maggot, and in length was about 3.5 inches. It was not, however, like a caterpillar, which is flexible throughout its entire length, but this was, as it seemed to me, jointed in 2 places, one joint being more conspicuous than the other. For some moments I was so completely paralyzed by astonishment that I remained motionless, looking at the thing, as it crawled along the carpet, a dull green carpet with darker green, almost black flowers in it. It had, as it seemed to me, a glossy head, distinctly marked, but as the light was not brilliant, I could not make out very clearly, and, moreover, the rapid movements prevented close scrutiny. Presently, with a shock still more startling than that produced by its apparition at the opening of the pocket of my greatcoat, I became convinced that what I saw was a finger, a human forefinger, and that the glossy head was no other than the nail. The finger did not seem to have been amputated. There was no sign of blood or laceration where the knuckle should be. But the extremity of the finger, or root rather, faded away to indistinctness, and I was unable to make out the root of the finger. I could see no hand, no body behind the finger, nothing whatever except a finger that had a little token of warm life in it, no coloration as though blood circulated in it. And this finger was in active motion, creeping along the carpet towards a wardrobe that stood against the wall, by the fireplace. I sprang off the bed and pursued it. Evidently the finger was alarmed, for it redoubled its pace, reached the wardrobe, and went under it. By the time I had arrived at the article of furniture, it had disappeared. I lit a Vesta match and held it beneath the wardrobe that was raised above the carpet by about 2 inches, on turned feet, but I could see nothing more of the finger. I got my umbrella and thrust it beneath, and raked forwards and backwards, right and left, and raked out flue, and nothing more solid. 2. I packed my portmanteau next day and returned to my home in the country. All desire for amusement in town was gone, and the faculty to transact business had departed as well. A languor and qualms had come over me, and my head was in a maze. I was unable to fix my thoughts on anything. At times I was disposed to believe that my wits were deserting me, at others that I was on the verge of a severe illness. Anyhow, whether likely to go off my head or not, or take to my bed, home was the only place for me, and homeward I sped accordingly. On reaching my country habitation, my servant, as usual, took my portmanteau to my bedroom, unstrapped it, but did not unpack it. I object to his throwing out the contents of my Gladstone bag. Not that there is anything in it he may not see, but that he puts my things where I cannot find them again. My clothes, he is welcome to place them where he likes and where they belong, and this latter he knows better than I do. But then, I carry about with me other things than a dress suit, and changes of linen and flannel. There are letters, papers, books, and the proper destinations of these are known only to myself. A servant has a singular and evil knack for putting away literary matter and odd volumes in such places that it takes the owner half a day to find them again. Although I was uncomfortable and my head in a whirl, I opened and unpacked my own portmanteau. As I was thus engaged, I saw something curled up in my collar box, the lid of which had got broken in by a boot heel impinging on it. I had pulled off the damaged cover to see if my collars had been spoiled, when something curled up inside suddenly rose on end and leapt, just like a cheese jumper, out of the box, over the edge of the Gladstone bag, and scurried away across the floor in a manner already familiar to me. I could not doubt for a moment what it was. Here was the finger again. It had come with me from London to the country. Whither it went on its run over the floor, I do not know. I was too bewildered to observe. Somewhat later, towards evening, I seated myself in my easy chair, took up a book and tried to read it. I was tired with the journey and the knocking about in town and the discomfort and alarm produced by the apparition of the finger. I felt worn out. I was unable to give my attention to what I read, and before I was aware, was asleep. Roused for an instant by the fall of the book from my hands, I speedily relapsed into unconsciousness. I am not sure that a doze in an armchair ever does good. It usually leaves me in a semi-stupid condition and with a headache. 5 minutes in a horizontal position on my bed is worth 30 in a chair. That is my experience. In sleeping in a sedentary position, the head is a difficulty. It drops forward or lolls on one side or the other and has to be brought back into a position in which the line of the center of gravity runs through the trunk. Otherwise, the head carries the body over in a sort of general capsize out of the chair onto the floor. I slept, on the occasion of which I am speaking, pretty healthily, because deadly weary. But I was brought to waking not by my head falling over the arm of the chair and my trunk tumbling after it, but by a feeling of cold extending from my throat to my heart. When I awoke, I was in a diagonal position, with my right ear resting on my right shoulder and exposing the left side of my throat, and it was here, where the jugular vein throbs, that I felt the greatest intensity of cold. At once I shrugged my left shoulder, rubbing my neck with the collar of my coat in so doing. Immediately, something fell off upon the floor, and I again saw the finger. My disgust, horror, were intensified when I perceived that it was dragging something after it, which might have been an old stocking, and which I took at first glance for something of the sort. The evening sun shone in through my window in a brilliant golden ray that lighted the object as it scrambled along. With this illumination, I was able to distinguish what the object was. It is not easy to describe it, but I will make the attempt. The finger I saw was solid and material. What it drew after it was neither, or was in a nebulous protoplasmic condition. The finger was attached to a hand that was curdling into matter and in process of acquiring solidity. Attached to the hand was an arm in a very filmy condition, and this arm belonged to a human body in a still more vaporous, immaterial condition. This was being dragged along the floor by the finger, just as a silkworm might pull after it the tangle of its web. I could see legs and arms and head and coat-tail, tumbling about and interlacing and disentangling again in a promiscuous manner. There were no bone, no muscle, no substance in the figure. The members were attached to the trunk, which was spineless, but they had evidently no functions, and were wholly dependent on the finger, which pulled them along in a jumble of parts as it advanced. In such confusion did the whole vaporous matter seem, that I cannot say for certain it was so, but the impression left on my mind was that one of the eyeballs was looking out at a nostril, and the tongue lolling out of one of the ears. It was, however, only for a moment that I saw this germ body. I cannot call by another name that which had not more substance than smoke. I saw it only so long as it was being dragged athwart the ray of sunlight. The moment it was pulled jerkily out of the beam into the shadow beyond, I could see nothing of it, only the crawling finger. I had not sufficient moral energy or physical force in me to rise, pursue, and stamp on the finger, and grind it with my heel into the floor. Both seemed drained out of me. What became of the finger, whither it went, how it managed to secrete itself, I do not know. I had lost the power to inquire. I sat in my chair, chilled, staring before me into space. "Please, sir," a voice said, "there's Mr. Square below, electrical engineer." "Eh?" I looked dreamily around. My valet was at the door. "Please, sir, the gentleman would be glad to be allowed to go over the house and see that all the electrical apparatus is in order." "Oh, indeed, yes, show him up." 3. I had recently placed the lighting of my house in the hands of an electrical engineer, a very intelligent man, a Mr. Square, for whom I had contracted a sincere friendship. He had built a shed with a dynamo out of sight, and had entrusted the laying of the wires to subordinates, as he had been busy with other orders and could not personally watch every detail. But he was not the man to let anything pass unobserved, and he knew that electricity was not a force to be played with. Bad or careless workmen will often insufficiently protect the wires or neglect the insertion of the lead, which serves as a safety valve in the event of the current being too strong. Houses may be set on fire, human beings fatally shocked by the neglect of a bad or slovenly workman. The apparatus for my mansion was but just completed, and Mr. Square had come to inspect it and to make sure that all was right. He was an enthusiast in the subject of electricity, and saw for it a vast perspective, the limits of which could not be predicted. All forces, said he, are correlated. When you have a force in one form, you may just turn it into this or that as you like. In one form, it's motive power. In another, it's light. In another, heat. Now we have electricity for illumination. We employ it, but not as freely as in the States, for propelling vehicles. Why should we have horses drawing our buses? We should use only electric trams. Why do we burn coal to warm our shins? There is electricity which throws out no filthy smoke as does coal. Why should we let the tides waste their energies in the Thames, in other estuaries? There we have nature supplying us, free, gratis, and for nothing, with all the force we want for propelling, for heating, for lighting. I will tell you something more, my dear sir, said Mr. Square. I have mentioned but 3 modes of force, and have instanced but a limited number of uses to which electricity may be turned. How is it with photography? Is not electric light becoming an artistic agent? I bet you, said he, before long it will become a therapeutic agent as well. Oh yes, I've heard of certain impostors with their life belts. Mr. Square did not relish this little dig I gave him. He winced, but returned to the charge. We don't know how to direct it all right, that's all, said he. I haven't taken the matter up, but others will, I bet. And we shall have electricity used as freely as now we use powders and pills. I don't believe in doctors' stuffs myself. I hold that disease lays hold of a man because he lacks physical force to resist it. Now, is it not obvious that you are beginning at the wrong end when you attack the disease? What you want is to supply force, make up for the lack of physical power, and force is force wherever you find it. Here motive, there illuminating, and so on. I don't see why a physician should not utilize the tide rushing out under London Bridge for restoring the feeble vigour of all who are languid and prey to disorder in the metropolis. It will come to that, I bet. And that is not all. Force is force everywhere. Political, moral force, physical force, dynamic force, heat, light, tidal waves, and so on, are all one. All is one. In time, we shall know how to galvanize into aptitude and moral energy all the limp and crooked consciences and wills that need taking in hand. As such, there always will be in modern civilization. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how it will be done. But in the future, the priest as well as the doctor will turn electricity on as his principal, nay, his only agent. And he can get his force anywhere, out of the running stream, out of the wind, out of the tidal wave. I'll give you an instance, continued Mr. Square, chuckling and rubbing his hands, to show you the great possibilities in electricity, used in a crude fashion. In a certain great city away far west in the States, a go-ahead place too, more so than New York, they had electric trams all up and down and along the roads to everywhere. The union men working for the company demanded the non-unionists should be turned off, but the company didn't see it. Instead, it turned off the union men. It had up its sleeve a sufficiency of the others and filled all places at once. The union men didn't like it and passed word that at a given hour on a certain day, every wire was to be cut. The company knew this by means of its spies and turned on, ready for them, 3 times the power into all the wires. At the fixed moment, up the poles went the strikers to cut the cables. And down they came 12 times quicker than they went up, I bet. Then there came wires to the hospitals from all quarters for stretchers to carry off the disabled men, some with broken arms, legs, ribs. 2 or 3 had their necks broken. I reckon the company was wonderfully merciful. It didn't put on sufficient force to make cinders of them, there and then. Possibly the opinion might not have liked it. Stopped the strike, did that? Great moral effect. All done by electricity. In this manner, Mr. Square was wont to rattle on. He interested me, and I came to think that there might be something in what he said, that his suggestions were not mere nonsense. I was glad to see Mr. Square enter my room, shown in by my man. I did not rise from my chair to shake his hand, for I had not sufficient energy to do so. In a languid tone I welcomed him and signed to him to take a seat. Mr. Square looked at me with some surprise. "Why, what's the matter?" he said. "You seem unwell. Not got the flu, have you?" "I beg your pardon?" "The influenza. Every 3rd person's crying out that he has it, and the sale of eucalyptus is enormous. Not that eucalyptus is any good. Influenza microbes, indeed. What care they for eucalyptus?" "You've gone down some steps of the ladder of life since I saw you last, Squire. How do you account for that?" I hesitated about mentioning the extraordinary circumstances that had occurred, but Square was a man who would not allow any beating about the bush. He was downright and straight, and in 10 minutes had got the entire story out of me. "Rather boisterous for your nerves, that, a crawling finger," said he. "It's a queer story taken on end." Then he was silent, considering. After a few minutes he rose and said, "I'll go and look at the fittings, and then I'll turn this little matter of yours over again, and see if I can't knock the bottom out of it. I'm kind of fond of these sort of things." Mr. Square was not a Yankee, but he had lived for some time in America, and affected to speak like an American. He used expressions, terms of speech common in the States, but had none of the transatlantic twang. He was a man absolutely without affectation in every other particular. This was his sole weakness, and it was harmless. The man was so thorough in all he did that I did not expect his return immediately. He was certain to examine every portion of the dynamo engine and all the connections and burners. This would necessarily engage him for some hours. As the day was nearly done, I knew he could not accomplish what he wanted that evening, and accordingly gave orders that a room should be prepared for him. Then, as my head was full of pain and my skin was burning, I told my servant to apologize for my absence from dinner, and tell Mr. Square that I was really forced to return to my bed by sickness, and that I believed I was about to be prostrated by an attack of influenza. The valet, a worthy fellow who has been with me for 6 years, was concerned at my appearance and urged me to allow him to send for a doctor. I had no confidence in the local practitioner, and if I sent for another from the nearest town, I should offend him, and a row would perhaps ensue, so I declined. If I were really in for an influenza attack, I knew about as much as any doctor how to deal with it. Quinine, that was all. I bade my man light a small lamp, lower it so as to give sufficient illumination to enable me to find some lime juice at my bedhead and my pocket handkerchief, and to be able to read my watch. When he had done this, I bade him leave me. I lay in bed, burning, racked with pain in my head, and with my eyeballs on fire. Whether I fell asleep or went off my head, I cannot tell. I may have fainted. I have no recollection of anything after having gone to bed and taking a sip of lime juice that tasted to me like soap, till I was roused by a sense of pain in my ribs, a slow, gnawing, torturing pain, waxing momentarily more intense. In half-consciousness I was partly dreaming and partly aware of actual suffering. The pain was real, but in my fancy I thought that a great maggot was working its way into my side, between my ribs. I seemed to see it. It twisted itself half round, then reverted to its former position, and again twisted itself, moving like a bradawl, not like a gimlet, which latter forms a complete revolution. This obviously must have been a dream, hallucination only, as I was lying on my back and my eyes were directed towards the bottom of the bed, and the coverlet and blankets and sheet intervened between my eyes and my side. But in fever one sees without eyes, and in every direction and through all obstruction. Roused thoroughly by an excruciating twinge, I tried to call out, and succeeded in throwing myself over on my right side, that which was in pain. At once I felt the thing withdrawn that was crawling, if I may use the word, in between my ribs. And now I saw, standing beside the bed, a figure that had its arm under the bedclothes and was slowly removing it. The hand was leisurely drawn from under the coverings and rested on the eider-down coverlet, with the forefinger extended. The figure was that of a man in shabby clothes, with a sallow, mean face, a retreating forehead, with hair cut after the French fashion, and a moustache, dark. The jaws and chin were covered with a bristly growth, as if shaving had been neglected for a fortnight. The figure did not appear to be thoroughly solid, but to be of the consistency of curd, and the face was of the complexion of curd. As I looked at this object, it withdrew, sliding backward in an odd sort of manner, and as though overweighted by the hand which was the most substantial, indeed the only substantial portion of it. Though the figure retreated stooping, yet it was no longer huddled along by the finger as if it had no material existence. If the same, it had acquired a consistency and a solidity which it did not possess before. How it vanished I do not know, nor whither it went. The door opened, and Square came in. "What?" he exclaimed with cheery voice. "Influenza, is it?" "I don't know. I think it's that finger again." 4. "Now, look here," said Square. "I'm not going to have that cuss at its pranks any more. Tell me all about it." I was now so exhausted, so feeble, that I was not able to give a connected account of what had taken place. But Square put to me just a few pointed questions and elicited the main facts. He pieced them together in his own orderly mind so as to form a connected whole. "There's a feature in the case," said he, "that strikes me as remarkable and important. At first, a finger only, then a hand, then a nebulous figure attached to the hand without backbone, without consistency. Lastly, a complete form, with consistency and with backbone, but the latter in a gelatinous condition, and the entire figure overweighted by the hand, just as hand and figure were previously overweighted by the finger. Simultaneously with this compacting and consolidating of the figure came your degeneration and loss of vital force and, in a word, of health. What you lose, that object acquires. And what it gains by contact with you. That's clear enough, is it not? I dare say, I don't know, I can't think. Suppose not. The faculty of thought is drained out from you. Very well. I must think for you, and I will. Force is force, and see if I can't deal with your visitant in such a way as will prove just as truly a moral dissuasive as that employed on the union men on strike in... never mind where it was. That's not the point. Will you kindly give me some lime juice? I entreated. I sipped the acid draught, but without relief. I listened to Square, but without hope. I wanted to be left alone. I was weary of my pain, weary of everything, even of life. It was a matter of indifference to me whether I recovered or slipped out of existence. "It will be here again shortly," said the engineer. "As the French say, l'appétit vient en mangeant. It has been at you thrice. It won't be content without another peck. And if it does get another, I guess it will pretty well about finish you." Mr. Square rubbed his chin and then put his hands into his trouser pockets. That also was a trick acquired in the States, an inelegant one. His hands, when not actively occupied, went into his pockets. Inevitably they gravitated thither. Ladies did not like Square. They said he was not a gentleman. But it was not that he said or did anything off colour. Only he spoke to them, looked at them, walked with them, always with his hands in his pockets. I have seen a lady turn her back on him deliberately because of this trick. Standing now with his hands in his pockets, he studied my bed and said contemptuously, "Old-fashioned and bad, four-poster. Oughtn't to be allowed, I guess. Unwholesome all the way round." I was not in a condition to dispute this. I like a four-poster with curtains at head and feet. Not that I ever draw them, but it gives a sense of privacy that is wanting in one of your half-tester beds. If there is a window at one's feet, one can lie in bed without the glare in one's eyes, and yet without darkening the room by drawing the blinds. There is much to be said for a four-poster, but this is not the place in which to say it. Mr. Square pulled his hands out of his pockets and began fiddling with the electric point near the head of my bed, attached a wire, swept it in a semicircle along the floor, and then thrust the knob at the end into my hand in the bed. "Keep your eye open," said he, "and your hand shut and covered. If that finger comes again tickling your ribs, try it with the point. I'll manage the switch from behind the curtain." Then he disappeared. I was too indifferent in my misery to turn my head and observe where he was. I remained inert with the knob in my hand and my eyes closed, suffering, and thinking of nothing but the shooting pains through my head and the aches in my loins and back and legs. Some time probably elapsed before I felt the finger again at work at my ribs. It groped, but no longer bored. I now felt the entire hand, not a single finger, and the hand was substantial, cold and clammy. I was aware, how I know not, that if the finger point reached the region of my heart on the left side, the hand would, so to speak, sit down on it, with the cold palm over it, and that then immediately my heart would cease to beat, and it would be, as Square might express it, gone coon with me. In self-preservation, I brought up the knob of the electric wire against the hand, against one of the ringers, I think, and at once was aware of a rapping, squealing noise. I turned my head languidly and saw the form, now more substantial than before, capering in an ecstasy of pain, endeavouring fruitlessly to withdraw its arm from under the bedclothes and the hand from the electric point. At the same moment, Square stepped out from behind the curtain with a dry laugh and said, "I thought we should fix him. He has the coil about him and can't escape. Now let us drop to particulars, but I shan't let off till I know all about you." The last sentence was addressed not to me, but to the apparition. Thereupon he bade me take the point away from the hand of the figure, being, whatever it was, but to be ready with it at a moment's notice. He then proceeded to catechize my visitor, who moved restlessly within the circle of wire, but could not escape from it. It replied in a thin, squealing voice that sounded as if it came from a distance and had a querulous tone in it. I do not pretend to give all that was said. I cannot recollect everything that passed. My memory was affected by my illness as well as my body, yet I prefer giving the scraps that I recollect to what Mr. Square told me he had heard. Yes, I was unsuccessful, always was. Nothing answered with me. The world was against me. Society was. I hate society. I don't like work neither, never did. But I like agitating against what is established. I hate the royal family, the landed interests, the parsons, everything that is, except the people, that is, the unemployed. I always did. I couldn't get work as suited me. When I died, they buried me in a cheap coffin, dirt cheap, and gave me a nasty grave, cheap, and the service rattled away cheap, and no monument. Didn't want none. Oh, there are lots of us, all discontented. Discontent. That's the passion it is. It gets into the veins, it fills the brain, it occupies the heart. It's a sort of divine cancer that takes possession of the entire man. and makes him dissatisfied with everything and hate everybody. But we must have our share of happiness at some time. We all crave for it in one way or other. Some think there's a future state of blessedness and so have hope and look to attain it, for hope is a cable and anchor that attaches to what is real. But when you have no hope of that sort, don't believe in any future state, you must look for happiness in life here. We didn't get it when we were alive, so we seek to procure it after we are dead. We can do it, if we can get out of our cheap and nasty coffins, but not until the greater part of us is moulded away. If a finger or two remains, that can work its way up to the surface. Those cheap deal coffins go to pieces quick enough. Then the only solid part of us left can pull the rest of us that has gone to nothing after it. Then we grope about after the living, the well-to-do if we can get at them, the honest working poor if we can't. We hate them too, because they are content and happy. If we reach any of these and can touch them, then we can draw their vital force out of them into ourselves and recuperate at their expense. That was about what I was going to do with you. Getting on famous, nearly solidified into a new man and given another chance of life. But I've missed it this time. Just like my luck. Miss everything. Always have. Except misery and disappointment. Get plenty of that.
What are you all?
Asked Square. Anarchists out of employ. Some of us go by that name, some by other designations. But we're all one and own allegiance to but one monarch. Sovereign discontent. We are bred to have a distaste for manual work, and we grow up loafers, grumbling at everything and quarrelling with society that is around us and the providence that is above us. And what do you call yourselves now? Call ourselves nothing. We are the same in another condition, that is all. Folk called us once anarchists, nihilists, socialists, levellers. Now they call us the influenza. The learned talk of microbes and bacilli and bacteria. Microbes, bacilli and bacteria be blowed. We are the influenza. We the social failures, the generally discontented, coming up out of our cheap and nasty graves in the form of physical disease. We are the influenza.
There you are, I guess, exclaimed Square triumphantly. Did I not say that all forces were correlated? If so, then all negotiations, deficiencies of force are one in their several manifestations. Talk of divine discontent as a force impelling to progress. Rubbish! It is a paralysis of energy. It turns all it absorbs to acid, to envy, spite, gall. It inspires nothing, but rots the whole moral system. Here you have it, moral, social, political discontent in another form, nay, aspect. That is all. What anarchism is in the body politic, that influenza is in the body physical. Do you see that?
Yes, I believe I answered, and dropped away into the land of dreams. I recovered. What Square did with the thing, I know not, but believe that he reduced it again to its former negative and self-decomposing condition.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back?
That was A Dead Finger by Sabine Baring-Gould. Very easy to call him Sabine Baring-Gould, but I made sure I checked the pronunciation. I do that more and more these days, because what I've realised is that there are many people out there who know a lot more than me about many things, and if I get them wrong, I haven't got a lot of room for manoeuvre, so I do a bit of checking.
this is the part of this, in case you hadn't realised, this is the part of the episode wherefore, unto, I start to talk about the story and the author. And this is the author. I just say little bits I've learned about him. I make comments about the story which arise to me. So think of it as having a conversation with your the single uncle you had, who always used to come round and after a couple of drinks would drone on about something that he didn't really know anything about. But you kind of were really fond of him, and so you put up with him. And that's what I would love you to have that attitude towards me. Now, by this time you will have all realised, if you haven't before, whether you want to listen to this or not. I'm talking too fast. If you do not want to listen to it, please stop. Do not put either of us through this, so you need to write a comment at the end and go, nonsense waffle. Yeah, fine, just stop listening to it. Okay, for those who love the nonsense waffle, and there are 95% of people who replied to a poll to say that they did. I'm talking to you now. So let's talk about this story. This story, A Dead Finger, was first published in the Cornhill magazine, a popular literary periodical of the time, in January 1902, and it was later included in Baring Gould's collection A Book of Ghosts, published in 1904. So, what did I think about this story? Well, I thought it was like a fever dream. It was a very odd story. And I don't think this is likely, he had taken a heroic dose of illicit substances. But I don't think that's true. And I'm not sure he did write it in the fever dream, although somebody may know more about him and say, oh yeah, it came from he got the idea when he had scarlet fever one time. Let's think about the time frame. We've done other weird stories before. The last one we did was Guy de Maupassant, who was French, and his stories are weird in a similar kind of pre-surrealist way. And why I say pre-surrealist, of course, the surrealists weren't a thing till the 1920s, and I think the Surrealist Manifesto came out in 1924, so this is like 20 years before that. However, it does have that odd juxtaposition, almost as this dream material was coming to him, and it's, you know how dreams are odd and bizarre and they don't fit with the real world. And the surrealists made a great play of this. But of course, the other reason to say why I don't think Baring Gould was a surrealist, which I'm not in any circumstances suggesting that, but even related to them or influenced by ideas that were floating around at the time, is that he was deeply, deeply conservative. And this shows in all aspects of his really interesting life. But anything new, he's not going to like it. So I don't think he's a surrealist, but I just think it's kind of weird. Talking about that, he was a very accomplished and interesting man, and was a clergyman. That's his main job. I don't know if you've come across Montague Summers, who wrote mainly so-called factual books about vampires. He was a priest as well, an Anglican priest, you know, and similar period, and both of those men were deeply conservative, really very reactionary figures. What struck me as really interesting is that, and you've heard the story, so there's no spoilers, that the cause of the ghost is the spirit, the representation of the undeserving poor. And so Baring Gould in this is an anti-Charles Dickens in many ways. Because, you know, in Dickens's ghost stories, the ghosts serve to advance what you might call a progressive. That is to say that the poor are suffering from the predations of the wealthy. Whereas this is the other way around. It's clearly the poor, it's their own fault. And it strikes me, and you know, I'm not making, so obviously I'm not espousing any particular point, any particular political standpoint, but I've observed in life that people who are generally on the left tend, and this isn't always true, but they tend to come from poorer backgrounds. They're the have-nots, if you like, or the have-less. Because in our Western societies are so much more wealthy than our ancestors, and also in other communities around the world. So The have-nots tend to be left. That is to say, I haven't got it, I want it. You've got it, I want it. That's the left. And so their view would be, the things that have gone wrong in my life are to do with the system. The system is rigged against me. And that may be true, because to an extent, most of these things have some truth in them. Because if you are, let's say, born in a sink council estate, and what I mean by that is the really deprived public housing, and it's all relative, with lots of crime, lots of mould on the ceilings, you've not got any money, you can't have the heating on, you don't have anything to eat, and the only things you can afford are low nutrition crap, so your health's poor, you take comfort the only way you know in smoking, drink and drugs, so your health is poor. So this is a familiar picture. So you may look and then compare somebody like M.R. James, who came from a wealthy background, went to the most prestigious public school in England, went to the most potentially, let's say, prestigious university. The Oxford people will be up in arms about that. But it's not. They didn't start in the same place. So there may be some justice to a view that says, this system's rigged against me. Everything. This is what the ghost says. Everything's against me. Let's flip it on the other side then. So the people on the other side, who tend to be the haves, as is human nature, they don't want to give it away. You ask me, right, you've worked since you were 15 years old, you're not on the street, you've got a house, you can afford to do this podcasting thing, why don't you give all your money away? No thanks. If I give it away, I'll give it to my friends and my family. I don't necessarily want to give it to, I may feel that I should, do give to charity, but this isn't about me being virtuous, it's about looking at the right-wing view, which tends to be, everything I've got through my hard work. Yeah, it's mine. Why should I give it to you? If I want to give it to you, then I will. And charitable causes, etc. There's a police. I always wonder, given the amount of sirens that go past in this small city, if there really are that many emergencies. They go by every 7 minutes. Are there that many life or death situations where the police and the other people need to put their sirens on? And having worked in the health service, I know I've been in the back of ambulances for people who were texting on their phones. There was nothing wrong with them. I'm talking about mental health people here. But even people, you've got this and they call an ambulance and you've got... Anyway, I digress. As usual. And I'm probably riling people now. So what I'm wanting to say is, it's always amused me that people... if you're on the left, it's like, I want that. I haven't got it. It's the system. And the people on the right it's mine. I'm not giving it to you. I've done it from my own hard work. And that isn't true either. If you were born into a privileged position, it isn't all your hard work. And also, say you start a company and it does well. The fact your workers were paid for, the roads were paid for, not by you. Their education wasn't, you didn't do it. Their health, you didn't do it, So, I think I'm saying you're playing on both your houses. I think I'm adopting a centrist position, is to say that probably the extremes of both sides are bad. And that was what my nana used to tell me. Moderation in all things, she said. She was a Methodist, of course. But there's something in it. And this is a bit of a digression, because Baring Gould, I was Googling this, and he's the only, and somebody called him a lefty hater. And said the only person who hates lefties more than Baring Gould is Dennis Wheatley. I thought that was amusing. Again, let us then, as we would with Philip Larkin or Seneca or any of these dudes, or Mark Twain, Henry James, whatever, we're gonna remove their, as much as we can. We're gonna look at the story for the story, without kind of cancelling them before we get there. I don't like your politics. I'm not going to read your stuff. Let's look at the story. So the story was, returning to the very point, weird. And I think it was very witty. I think that his portrait of Mr. Square, the American influence, although without the transatlantic twang, thank goodness for me, my accent, Mr. Square. It was really, really funny. And also the picture of the protagonist, who becomes increasingly vapid and neurotic. Almost, and I'm like, I think that Baring Gould is caricaturing both of these, the practical man of the world, knows things about electricity, and the please give me some juice, sort of pathetic, takes to his bed at the slightest. I just read an Agatha Christie story, of course, with again a complicated character, which was the case of the perfect maid. Fantastic. Nip over to the detective channel, my detective, classic detective stories channel, and that's a great story. It's coming out. It hasn't actually out yet, but it'll be out. So, but I've got plenty of other stories like that. Anyway, so she in that story is again a neurotic, a hypochondriac really, and so I thought that Baring Gould's pictures of both these characters was really funny. There were some other really interesting ideas in it. The first is Mr. Square with his espousal of the powers of electricity. Another thought occurs to me, which I will park and maybe come back to. He is very perspicacious, isn't he? He's very far-seeing. This idea of electrical power from the waves, the tides, the sun, the moon, and not the moon, he doesn't say that just popped out of my head from somewhere. He's right, isn't he? How did this is 1904, 1902. It was published in the collection in 1904. Wow, amazing. And of course, it also made me think of the theory of everything. Physicists have been battling to try and tie all the known forces, gravity and electrical force and all the others, into one unified, and they go up to string theory. Again, there are people out there who know a lot more about this than me. But, and they've failed so far, and may always fail, and maybe that it isn't true. But they're doing their best. Fair play to them. And but it seems that Mr. Square has already got one. Everything is electricity, but further than just the gravitational in the electrical field, he's talking about moral energy, and he thinks that is, and so he sees how doctors and priests will be able to correct problems in their patients or their parishioners through applying electricity. And this is his whole theory, that how he's going to sort the ghost out. So how far Baring Gould actually believed this is really interesting. And when we look at the idea of vitalism, which was a theory that came in the middle to the late 18th century, and I've looked this up. So Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and Hans Driesch, they have this idea that there is one force, which is the life force, that the thing that makes us live and goes through the animals and the plants as well is the life force, and it is a force like electricity, and the two get conflated, and so we have this idea that life is created by electricity. And of course we see this in 1819 in Frankenstein. The monster is animated through electricity. So this was a prevalent idea, or a popular idea, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it's developed or taken on by Franz Anton Mesmer. Mesmerism, you'll have heard of him, born 1734, died 1815. And he was a German physician with an interest in astronomy. That's something to do with lack of holes, I think, in Greek. So he theorized the process of natural energy, this vitalism, and he called it animal magnetism. And it was about not so much that, not just that we're animated by this force, but that it's transferred, and that it could be manipulated through mesmerism. Of course, develops into hypnotism. And the original idea, I don't think any proponents of hypnotism say that, it was something to do with the hypnotist, the mesmerist, manipulating this electrical force. So Mesmer would sit in front of patients with his knees touching the patient's knees, pressing the patient's thumbs in his hands, looking fixedly into the patient's eyes. He made passes, i.e. moving his hands from the patient's shoulders down along their arms. He then pressed the fingers on the patient's hypochondrium, the area below the diaphragm. Hypochondriac, sometimes holding his hands there for hours. Many patients felt peculiar sensations or had convulsions that were regarded as crises and were supposed to bring about the cure. So this is really interesting because it's very similar to that faith healing idea where they push them and then they're cured, you know. So, and it is not dissimilar to EMDR. EMDR, the eye programming, which clearly has effects. And there are various theories about reprogramming the hypothalamus or something. But as far as I can tell, that's all balderdash. And it's just another form. Again, there's some therapists out there going to be saying, how dare you? It's another form to me, or at least we should entertain the idea that it's another form of mesmerism. We've digressed a little bit, an interesting digression, I think. The point I wanted to make was, of course, that mesmerism and this idea of vitalism was pretty repudiated by the beginning of the 20th century when Baring Gould wrote this story. But he seems to kind of still be advocating for it in a way, or Mr. Square is. And we have to always be careful that we don't make the mistake to think that a character's views are the author's views. This happens such a lot, but it isn't true. You know, a creative writer puts words that he or she doesn't believe in the mouths of their characters. So, but it's interesting that clearly this is given as by Mr. Square and not challenged at all in the story by Baring Gould. So I kind of think he maybe did think it. And if he did think it, in this, as in every other aspect of his life, he was old-fashioned and conservative. The other thing I wanted to say was that he talks about the thing materializes like curd and slowly. And this, of course, if you look at spiritualism and the mediums in the late 19th and early 20th century, ectoplasm was the big thing. So ectoplasm is this curd-like material that exudes from the medium and that the spirits use to materialize themselves. And this was found to be massively fraudulent. You may not be surprised to hear that. But it was the idea that this stuff, if you look at pictures of ectoplasm, it's this kind of curd-like stuff that gradually changes and becomes more and more solid until the ghost materialized in it. So, I mean, I think this is what we're seeing here, that whether he intended that on purpose and was a believer in it, I don't know about that, honestly. But, or he's just absorbed it from his cultural milieu of the time he was writing. There we go. So, let me say something about the man himself. So, he was born into an upper-class family in Exeter, Devon, as the eldest son of Edward Baring Gould, a Justice of the Peace and Deputy Lieutenant of Devon, and Sophia Charlotte Bond, daughter of Admiral Francis Godolphin Bond. His privileged background offered him a robust education, initially through private tutors during the family's extensive travels across Europe. He later attended King's College School in London and King's School in Warwick. In 1852, he went to Clare College, Cambridge, where he got his BA in 1857 and his Masters in 1860. He was a true polymath, though, whose notable achievements spanned various fields. As an author, he wrote over 1,200 publications, including novels such as Mehala, a story of the salt marshes, The Broom Squire, and a folklore study. I talked about Montague Summers before. Montague Summers famously wrote about vampires. Baring Gould's classic book in this case was The Book of Werewolves, 1865. He's really famous for his hymn writing. So hymns, really famous hymns like Onward Christian Soldiers and Now the Day is Over, he wrote. In separation from that, he also wrote songs and ballads of the West, and he collected folk music, and he was deeply attached to the folk traditions. He co-authored English folk songs for schools in 1907 with the famous Cecil Sharp. He was also a dedicated archaeologist and preservationist, organising the first scientific archaeological excavations of Dartmoor at Grimspound with Robert Bernard, and contributing to the systematic recording and restoration of prehistoric sites. So you can see the breadth of the man, and this is not, and although he dabbled in all these fields, he made significant contributions to them. He wasn't playing at it. When he did his archaeology, he did it properly. When he wrote his hymns, he wrote good ones. when he did his folklore studies, they were properly done and highly regarded. So what a great guy. But he was, and it's really interesting, he managed to be a vicar, a clergyman at the same time, suggesting perhaps they didn't have enough work to do. I think the vicars these days have 20 parishes to cover in the Anglican Church, so they don't maybe get the time that these gentlemen, clergymen of Victorian period had to pursue their other aspects. You may not be surprised that he was an Anglican. He was a backward-looking Anglican, because again, this theme in all of these things, collecting folk songs, archaeology, his deep commitment to the Christianity that had been a feature of life for 2,000 years. His books, it's interesting, his books are werewolves, but I think that's like his interest in folk traditions, to be honest. So there's nothing progressive about the guy, and that isn't a criticism, it's an observation. And he was a backward-looking Anglican. So in his early days, he very much looked at the Anglican Church as being a continuation of Celtic Christianity. So what you may know is that Britain became first Christian during the Roman occupation, and then the Romans left in 412, leaving a system of bishoprics based. So the whole issue of parishes and provinces and bishops and archbishops is based on Roman civil administration. Basically, when Christianity came, it got grafted on to the Roman civil administration. So this was how they managed their provinces, and each province had an archbishop, and then the sub-provinces had bishops, and then the little local areas, parishes, had vicars, or priests. And Christianity went, and across the urban Roman Empire, this structure remained, but it collapsed in Britain due to the incoming of the Anglo-Saxons, those Vandals, and they're not Vandals, they were closely related to the Vandals. They smashed everything up and destroyed the culture that was here. They were colonisers, let's get that clear. I say that with a tongue in my cheek. It's nevertheless true in very strict sense, but I'm playing with the modern usage of the word. So the Anglo-Saxons come in and they destroy everything. But in the mountainous, wild west and north of Britain and Ireland, which was Christianised from Britain, we have what became the Celtic Christianity, which was more nature-based, was built more around, because they didn't have towns as such, was built around monks who would go out and sit in caves and contemplate, very much like Indian sadhus and stuff like that, and then collections of monks that became abbeys, and so that it was a monastic Christianity. It may be more spiritual. I don't know. I'm not getting into that really. But and then what happened was the Romans came back, or not the Romans, but the Roman Church came back through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Kent and re-established a system of bishops and archbishops and things, potentially still on some historical basis, but I'm not an expert in that at all. This is just to give you the idea. That's Celtic Christianity. And then we get to good old Henry VIII in the 1500s, and he breaks with Rome, and he isn't actually a Protestant. He's a Catholic, but he has his own reasons, a psychopath, and he has his own reasons for his own advancement of breaking with Rome, but in religious terms he remained a Catholic. However, there were Protestant reformers at that time, and they kind of grabbed hold of this break with Rome to Protestantize the English Church. So the English Church became a Protestant church. Well, in fact, if you're familiar with Anglican or Episcopal, you will see they're very, very similar still in form to Catholic services. Not quite the same, but there's a lot. And there was the High Church, which was more Catholic, and the Low Church, which was more evangelical. So the evangelicals and the austere Protestants didn't want any of the fancy stuff. Smashed all the stained glass windows. Do not want statues. The most you might get is a plain wooden cross on a plain table, or not even that, So, and that is the evangelical side. Well, he did not like his view was the Anglican Church, because what's very important in Christianity is apostolic succession. So the idea that Christ gives the keys to Peter, and in unbroken succession each bishop is anointed by a bishop without going right directly back to Christ. So without a break, that's the theory. And so once the Anglican Church had broken from the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, you could argue that this was broken. So Baring Gould is about, and he's not alone, there is an Anglican movement for this, is to say, no, yes, okay, we broke with Rome, but they were corrupt, and we were re-establishing our lineage to the pure Celtic Church, which can trace its lineage right back through Christ, to Christ. Yeah? So that's what he's doing there. And later on he became part of the Tractarian movement, also known as the Oxford movement. And so this was, and Baring Gould's religious views were shaped by a desire to revive and maintain the Catholic elements within Anglicanism. And Tractarianism, which was an heir of the Oxford movement, emerged in the early 19th century through figures like John Henry Newman, John Keble, emphasizing the importance of traditional liturgy, apostolic succession, and the sacraments. The movement sought to restore the rich ritualistic practices of the early church, challenging the more Protestant focus that had prevailed since the Reformation. So Baring Gould's there, no surprise. He was critical of evangelicalism, viewing it as a departure from the rich traditions and theological depth of Anglo-Catholicism. In his work, The Evangelical Revival 1920, he wrote condescendingly about key evangelical figures like John Wesley and George Whitefield and the movement they inspired. Baring Gould believed that evangelicalism, with its emphasis on personal conversion and simplistic piety, lacked the historical continuity and sacramental focus that he valued in the Church of England. He saw evangelicalism as overly emotional. I think that's that kind of, the faith healing and the almost, well, some people may consider them hysterical practices, the speaking in tongues and things like that. Doctrinally shallow. So, but he would say that, wouldn't he? That he is, as we've said, a absolute exemplar of conservatism in every sense. So we talked about the story, which was weird and interesting and funny and unusual, because instead of the Dickensian view of the ghosts as being basically freedom fighters for the poor, they're not, but you know what I mean. Certainly in Dickens they are. He's the other side, and I thought it's always worth seeing the other side, And I think he was a polymath. He really was a very talented man. And his views, his deep conservative views, they weren't unthought through. And so I thought it was worth including. When I discuss these things, please understand, I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm not actually being polemical. I'm not saying, yes, this is the truth, and anybody else who thinks it's wrong. I don't even know if this is the truth. I'm just interested in the ideas, and I know many, many of you are. So if you do feel like penning a critical commentary about what you suppose my views are, don't. And with that, I'll go back and walk the dogs. Actually, I'm not going to walk the dogs because Sheila's come back from Spain. So she's been away in Spain doing some kind of New Age thing on a mountain of selenite, so she says. But she saw some she got a boar tooth, came across wild boars and snakes, and sounds like she had a great old time. I was walking the dogs, mainly walking the dogs and recording podcasts. And she's doing it now, so I don't know what to do with my time. Guess what? I'll record a podcast. You think I'd come up with something more creative, wouldn't you? What else are you going to do, Tony? I'll record a podcast. Anyway, I hope you're all well. I'm actually fine. But I do just want to thank you for your support, because it keeps me going and it means a lot to me. So thanks for listening. Thank you. The Demon Lover by Shirley Jackson. Narrated by Tony Walker. She had not slept well. From 1:30 when Jamie left and she went lingeringly to bed, until 7 when she at last allowed herself to get up and make coffee, she had slept fitfully, stirring awake to open her eyes and look into the half-darkness, remembering over and over, slipping again into a feverish dream. She spent almost an hour over her coffee. They were to have a real breakfast on the way, and then, unless she wanted to dress early, had nothing to do. She washed her coffee cup and made the bed, looking carefully over the clothes she planned to wear, worried unnecessarily at the window over whether it would be a fine day. She sat down to read, thought that she might write a letter to her sister instead, and began in her finest handwriting, "Dearest Anne, by the time you get this, I will be married." Doesn't it sound funny? I can hardly believe it myself, but when I tell you how it happened, you'll see it's even stranger than that. Sitting, pen in hand, she hesitated over what to say next, read the lines already written, and tore up the letter. She went to the window and saw that it was undeniably a fine day. It occurred to her that perhaps she ought not to wear the blue silk dress. It was too plain, almost severe, and she wanted to be soft, feminine. Anxiously, she pulled through the dresses in the closet and hesitated over a print she'd worn the summer before. It was too young for her, and it had a ruffled neck, and it was very early in the year for a print dress, but still. She hung the two dresses side by side on the outside of the closet door and opened the glass doors carefully closed on the small closet that was her kitchenette. She turned on the burner under the coffee pot and went to the window. It was sunny. When the coffee pot began to crackle, she came back and poured herself coffee into a clean cup. "I'll have a headache if I don't get some solid food soon," she thought. All this coffee, smoking too much, no real breakfast, a headache on her wedding day. She went and got the tin box of aspirin from the bathroom closet and slipped it into her blue pocketbook. She'd have to change to a brown pocketbook if she wore the print dress. And the only brown pocketbook she had was shabby. Helplessly she stood looking from the blue pocketbook to the print dress, and then put the pocketbook down and went and got her coffee and sat down near the window, drinking her coffee and looking carefully around the one-room apartment. They planned to come back here tonight and everything must be correct. With sudden horror she realized that she had forgotten to put clean sheets on the bed. The laundry was freshly back and she took clean sheets and pillowcases from the top shelf of the closet and stripped the bed, working quickly to avoid thinking consciously of why she was changing the sheets. The bed was a studio bed with a cover to make it look like a couch, and when it was finished, no one would have known she had just put clean sheets on it. She took the old sheets and pillowcases into the bathroom and stuffed them down into the hamper, and put the bathroom towels in the hamper too, and clean towels on the bathroom racks. Her coffee was cold when she came back to it, but she drank it anyway. When she looked at the clock finally and saw that it was after 9, she began at last to hurry. She took a bath and used one of the clean towels which she put into the hamper and replaced with a clean one. She dressed carefully, all her underwear fresh and most of it new. She put everything she had worn the day before, including her nightgown, into the hamper. When she was ready for her dress, she hesitated before the closet door. The blue dress was certainly decent and clean and fairly becoming, but she had worn it several times with Jamie, and there was nothing about it which made it special for a wedding day. The print dress was overly pretty and new to Jamie, and yet wearing such a print this early in the year was certainly rushing the season. Finally, she thought, this is my wedding day. I can dress as I please. And she took the print dress down from the hanger. When she slipped it on over her head, it felt fresh and light. But when she looked at herself in the mirror, she remembered that the ruffles around her neck did not show her throat to any great advantage, and the wide swinging skirt looked irresistibly made for a girl, for someone who would run freely, dance, swing it with her hips when she walked. Looking at herself in the mirror, she thought with revulsion, "It's as though I was trying to make myself look prettier than I am, just for him. He'll think I want to look younger because he's marrying me." And she tore the print dress off so quickly that the seam under the arm ripped. In the old blue dress, she felt comfortable and familiar, but unexciting. "It isn't what you're wearing that matters," she told herself firmly, and turned in dismay to the closet to see if there might be something else. There was nothing even remotely suitable for her marrying Jamie, and for a minute she thought of going out quickly to some little shop nearby to get a dress. Then she saw that it was close on 10, and she had no time for more than her hair and her makeup. Her hair was easy, pulled back into a knot at the nape of her neck, but her makeup was another delicate balance between looking as well as possible and deceiving as little. She could not try to disguise the sallowness of her skin or the lines around her eyes today, when it might look as though she were only doing it for her wedding. And yet she could not bear the thought of Jamie's bringing to marriage anyone who looked haggard and lined. "You're 34 years old after all," she told herself cruelly in the bathroom mirror. 30, it said on the license. It was 2 minutes after 10. She was not satisfied with her clothes, her face, her apartment. She heated the coffee again and sat down in the chair by the window. Can't do anything more now, she thought. No sense trying to improve anything the last minute. Reconciled, settled, she tried to think of Jamie and could not see his face clearly or hear his voice. It's always that way with someone you love, she thought, and let her mind slip past today and tomorrow into the farther future, when Jamie was established with his writing and she had given up her job, the golden house in the country future they had been preparing for the last week. "I used to be a wonderful cook," she had promised Jamie. "With a little time and practice, I could remember how to make angel food cake and fried chicken," she said, knowing how the words would stay in Jamie's mind, half tenderly. "And hollandaise sauce." 10:30. She stood up and went purposefully to the door. She dialed and waited, and the girl's metallic voice said, "The time will be exactly 10:29. Half-consciously, she set her clock back a minute. She was remembering her own voice saying last night in the doorway, 10 o'clock then. I'll be ready. Is it really true?" And Jamie laughing down the hallway. By 11 o'clock, she had sewed up the ripped seam in the print dress and put her sewing box away carefully in the closet. With the print dress on, she was sitting by the window drinking another cup of coffee. I could have taken more time over my dressing after all, she thought. But by now it was so late he might come at any minute, and she did not dare try to repair anything without starting all over. There was nothing to eat in the apartment except the food she had carefully stocked up for their life beginning together, the unopened package of bacon, the dozen eggs in their box, the unopened bread and the unopened butter. They were for breakfast tomorrow. She thought of running downstairs to the drugstore for something to eat, leaving a note on the door. Then she decided to wait a little longer. By 11:30 she was so dizzy and weak that she had to go downstairs. If Jamie had had a phone, she would have called him then. Instead, she opened her desk and wrote a note. "Jamie, have gone downstairs to the drugstore, back in 5 minutes." Her pen leaked onto her fingers, and she went into the bathroom and washed, using a clean towel, which she replaced. She tacked the note on the door, surveyed the apartment once more to make sure that everything was perfect, and closed the door without locking it, in case he should come. In the drugstore, she found that there was nothing she wanted to eat except more coffee, and she left it half-finished because she suddenly realized that Jamie was probably upstairs, waiting and impatient, anxious to get started. But upstairs everything was prepared and quiet as she had left it. Her note, unread, on the door. The air in the apartment a little stale from too many cigarettes. She opened the window and sat down next to it until she realized that she had been asleep and it was 20 minutes to 1. Now, suddenly, she was frightened. Waking without preparation into the room of waiting and readiness, everything clean and untouched since 10 o'clock, she was frightened and felt an urgent need to hurry. She got up from the chair and almost ran across the room to the bathroom, dashed cold water on her face and used a clean towel. This time, she put the towel carelessly back on the rack without changing it. Time enough for that later. Hatless, still in the print dress with a coat thrown on over it, the wrong blue pocketbook with the aspirin inside in her hand, she locked the apartment door behind her. No note this time, and ran down the stairs. She caught a taxi on the corner and gave the driver Jamie's address. It was no distance at all. She could have walked it if she'd not been so weak. But in the taxi, she suddenly realised how imprudent it would be to drive brazenly up to Jamie's door, demanding him. She asked the driver, therefore, to let her off at a corner near Jamie's address, and after paying him, waited till he drove away before she started to walk down the block. She had never been here before. The building was pleasant and old, and Jamie's name was not on any of the mailboxes in the vestibule, nor on the doorbells. She checked the address. It was right. And finally she rang the bell marked Superintendent. After a minute or two, the door buzzer rang, and she opened the door and went into the dark hall, where she hesitated until the door at the end opened and someone said, "Yes?" She knew at the same moment that she had no idea what to ask. So she moved forward toward the figure waiting against the light of the open doorway. When she was very near, the figure said, "Yes," again, and she saw that it was a man in his shirt sleeves, unable to see her any more clearly than she could see him. With sudden courage, she said, "I'm trying to get in touch with someone who lives in this building, and I can't find the name outside." "What's the name you wanted?" the man asked, and she realised that she would have to answer. "James Harris," she said. "Harris." The man was silent for a minute, and then he said, "Harris." He turned around to the room inside the lighted doorway and said, "Maggie, come here a minute." "What now?" a voice said from inside, and after a wait long enough for someone to get out of a comfortable chair, a woman joined him in the doorway, regarding the dark hall. "Lady here," the man said. "Lady looking for a guy named Harris lives here. Anyone in the building?" "No," the woman said. Her voice sounded amused. "No men named Harris here." "Sorry," the man said. He started to close the door. "You got the wrong house, lady," he said, and added in a lower voice, "Or the wrong guy." And he and the woman laughed. When the door was almost shut, and she was alone in the dark hall, she said to the thin lighted crack still showing, "But he does live here. I know it." "Look," the woman said, opening the door again a little. "It happens all the time." "Please don't make any mistakes," she said, and her voice was very dignified, with 34 years of accumulated pride. "I'm afraid you don't understand." "What do he look like?" the woman said wearily, the door still only part open. "He's rather tall and fair. He wears a blue suit very often. He's a writer." "No," the woman said, and then, "Could he have lived on the 3rd floor?" "I'm not sure." "There was a fella," the woman said reflectively. "He wore a blue suit a lot, lived on the 3rd floor for a while. The Roysters lent him their apartment while they were visiting her folks upstate. That might be it. I thought, though, this one wore a blue suit mostly, but I don't know how tall he was," the woman said. "He stayed there about a month. A month ago is when—" "You asked the Roysters," the woman said. "They come back this morning, apartment 3B. The door closed definitely. The hall was very dark, and the stairs looked darker. On the 2nd floor there was a little light from a skylight far above. The apartment doors lined up, 4 on the floor, uncommunicative and silent. There was a bottle of milk outside 2C. On the 3rd floor, she waited for a minute. There was the sound of music beyond the door of 3B, and she could hear voices. Finally, she knocked, and knocked again. The door was opened, and the music swept out at her, an early afternoon symphony broadcast. "How do you do?" she said politely to this woman in the doorway. "Mrs. Royster?" "That's right." The woman was wearing a housecoat and last night's makeup. I wonder if I might talk to you for a minute." "Sure," Mrs. Royster said, not moving. "About Mr. Harris." "What Mr. Harris?" Mrs. Royster said flatly. "Mr. James Harris, the gentleman who borrowed your apartment." "Oh, Lord," Mrs. Royster said. She seemed to open her eyes for the first time. "What did he do?" Nothing. I'm just trying to get in touch with him. Oh, Lord, Mrs. Royster said again. Then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in." And then, "Ralph!" Inside, the apartment was still full of music, and there were suitcases half unpacked on the couch, on the chairs, on the floor. A table in the corner was spread with the remains of a meal, and the young man sitting there, for a minute resembling Jamie, got up and came across the room. "What about it?" he said. "Mr. Royster," she said. It was difficult to talk against the music. "The superintendent downstairs told me that this was where Mr. James Harris has been living." "Sure," he said, if that was his name. I thought you lent him the apartment," she said, surprised. "I don't know anything about him," Mr. Royster said. "He's one of Dottie's friends." "Not my friends," Mrs. Royster said. "No friend of mine." She had gone over to the table and was spreading peanut butter on a piece of bread. She took a bite and said thickly, waving the bread and peanut butter at her husband, "Not my friend." "You picked him up at one of those damn meetings," Mr. Royster said. He shoved a suitcase off the chair next to the radio and sat down, picking up a magazine from the floor next to him. "I never said more than 10 words to him." "You said it was okay to lend him the place," Mrs. Royster said before she took another bite. "You never said a word against him after all." "I don't say anything about your friends," Mr. Royster said. "If he'd been a friend of mine, you would have said plenty, believe me," Mrs. Royster said darkly. She took another bite and said, "Believe me, he would have said plenty." "That's all I want to hear," Mr. Royster said over the top of the magazine. "No more now." "You see?" Mrs. Royster pointed the bread and peanut butter at her husband. "That's the way it is, day and night." There was silence except for the music bellowing out of the radio next to Mr. Royster, and then she said, in a voice she hardly trusted to be heard over the radio noise, "Has he gone then?" "Who?" Mrs. Royster demanded, looking up from the peanut butter jar. "Mr. James Harris." "Him! He must have left this morning before we got back. No sign of him anywhere. Gone. Everything was fine, though, perfectly fine. I told you," she said to Mr. Royster, "I told you to take care of everything fine. I can always tell." "You were lucky," Mr. Royster said. "Not a thing out of place," Mrs. Royster said. She waved her bread and peanut butter inclusively. "Everything just the way we left it," she said. "Do you know where he is now?" "Not the slightest idea," Mrs. Royster said cheerfully. "But, like I said, he left everything fine." "Why?" she asked suddenly. "You're looking for him?" "It's very important." "I'm sorry, he's not here," Mrs. Royster said. She stepped forward politely when she saw her visitor turn toward the door. "Maybe the super saw him," Mr. Royster said into the magazine. When the door was closed behind her, the hall was dark again, but the sound of the radio was deadened. She was halfway down the first flight of stairs when the door was opened, and Mrs. Royster shouted down the stairwell, "If I see him, I'll tell him you're looking for him." What can I do? She thought, out on the street again. It was impossible to go home, not with Jamie somewhere between here and there. She stood on the sidewalk so long that a woman, leaning out of a window across the way, turned and called to someone inside to come and see. Finally, on an impulse, she went into the small delicatessen next door to the apartment house, on the side that led to her own apartment. There was a small man reading a newspaper, leaning against the counter. When she came in, he looked up and came down inside the counter to meet her. Over the glass case of cold meats and cheese, she said timidly, "I'm trying to get in touch with a man who lived in the apartment house next door, and I just wondered if you know him." "Why don't you ask the people there?" the man said, his eyes narrow, inspecting her. "It's because I'm not buying anything," she thought, and she said, I'm sorry I asked them, but they don't know anything about him. They think he left this morning." "I don't know what you want me to do," he said, moving a little back toward his newspaper. "I'm not here to keep track of guys going in and out next door." She said quickly, "I thought you might have noticed, that's all. He would have been coming past here a little before 10 o'clock. He was rather tall, and he usually wore a blue suit." Know how many men in blue suits go past here every day, lady? The man demanded. You think I've got nothing to do but... I'm sorry, she said. She heard him say, for God's sake, as she went out the door. As she walked toward the corner, she thought, he must have come this way. It's the way he'd go to get to my house. It's the only way for him to walk. She tried to think of Jamie. Where would he have crossed the street? What sort of person was he, actually? Would he cross in front of his own apartment house? At random, in the middle of the block? At the corner? On the corner was a newsstand, and they might have seen him there. She hurried on and waited while a man bought a paper and a woman asked directions. When the newsstand man looked at her, she said, Can you possibly tell me if a rather tall young man in a blue suit went past here this morning around 10 o'clock? When the man only looked at her, his eyes wide and his mouth a little open, she thought, he thinks it's a joke or a trick. And she said urgently, It's very important. Please believe me, I'm not teasing you. Look, lady, the man began, and she said eagerly, He's a writer. He might have bought magazines here. What you want him for? The man asked. He looked at her, smiling, and she realized that there was another man waiting in back of her, and the newsdealer's smile included him. Never mind, she said. But the newsdealer said, Listen, maybe he did come by here. His smile was knowing, and his eyes shifted over her shoulder to the man in the back of her. She was suddenly horribly aware of her over-young print dress and pulled her coat around her quickly. The newsdealer said with vast thoughtfulness, Now, I don't know for sure, mind you, but there might have been someone like your gentleman friend coming by this morning. About 10. About 10, the newsdealer agreed. Tall fella, blue suit. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Which way did he go? She said eagerly. Uptown? Uptown, the newsdealer said, nodding. He went uptown. That's just exactly it. What can I do for you, sir? She stepped back, holding her coat around her. The man who had been standing behind her looked at her over his shoulder, and then he and the newsdealer looked at one another. She wondered for a minute whether or not to tip the newsdealer, but when both men began to laugh, she moved hurriedly on across the street. Uptown, she thought, that's right, and she started up the avenue, thinking. He wouldn't have to cross the avenue, just go up about 6 blocks and turn down my street, so long as he started uptown. About a block farther on, she passed a florist's shop. There was a wedding display in the window, and she thought, this is my wedding day after all. He might have gotten flowers to bring me. And she went inside. The florist came out the back of the shop, smiling and sleek, and she said, before he could speak, so that he wouldn't have a chance to think she was buying anything, It's terribly important that I get in touch with a gentleman who may have stopped in here to buy flowers this morning. Terribly important. She stopped for breath, and the florist said, Yeah, what sort of flowers were they? I don't know, she said, surprised. He never... She stopped and said, He was a rather tall young man in a blue suit. It was about 10 o'clock. I see, the florist said. Well, really, I'm afraid. But it's so important, she said. He may have been in a hurry, she added helpfully. Well, the florist said. He smiled genially, showing all his small teeth. For a lady, he said. He went to a stand and opened a large book. Where were they to be sent? He asked. Why, she said, I don't think he'd have sent them. You see, he was coming, that is, he'd bring them. Madam, the florist said. He was offended. His smile became deprecatory, and he went on. Really, you must realize that unless I have something to go on... Please try to remember, she begged. He was tall and had a blue suit, and it was about 10 this morning. The florist closed his eyes, one finger to his mouth, and thought deeply. Then he shook his head. I simply can't, he said. Thank you, she said despondently, and started for the door. When the florist said in a shrill, excited voice, Wait, just a moment, madam. She turned, and the florist, thinking again, said finally, Chrysanthemums? He looked at her inquiringly. "Oh, no," she said. Her voice shook a little, and she waited for a minute before she went on. "Not for an occasion like this, I'm sure." The florist tightened his lips and looked away coldly. "Well, of course, I don't know the occasion," he said, "but I'm almost certain that the gentleman you were inquiring for came in this morning and purchased 12 chrysanthemums. No delivery." "You're sure?" she asked. "Positive," the florist said emphatically. "That was absolutely the man." He smiled brilliantly, and she smiled back and said, "Well, thank you very much." He escorted her to the door. "Nice corsage," he said, as they went through the shop. "Red roses, gardenias." "It was very kind of you to help me," she said at the door. "Ladies always look their best in flowers," he said, bending his head toward her. "Orchids, perhaps." "No, thank you," she said, and he said, "I hope you find your young man," and gave it a nasty sound. Going on up the street, she thought, "Everyone thinks it's so funny," and she pulled her coat tighter around her so that only the ruffle around the bottom of the print dress was showing. There was a policeman on the corner, and she thought, "Why don't I go to the police?" You go to the police for a missing person. And then thought, what a fool I'd look like. She had a quick picture of herself standing in a police station saying, "Yes, we were going to be married today, but he didn't come." And the policemen, 3 or 4 of them, standing around listening, looking at her, at the print dress, at her too bright makeup, smiling at one another. She couldn't tell them any more than that. Couldn't say, "Yes, it looks silly, doesn't it? Me all dressed up and trying to find the young man who promised to marry me. But what about all of it you don't know? I have more than this, more than you can see. Talent, perhaps, a humour of a sort, and I'm a lady, and I have pride and affection and delicacy, and a certain clear view of life that might make a man satisfied and productive and happy. There's more than you think when you look at me." The police were obviously impossible, leaving out Jamie and what he might think when he heard she set the police after him. "No, no," she said aloud, hurrying her steps, and someone passing stopped and looked after her. On the coming corner, she was 3 blocks from her own street, was a shoe shine stand, an old man sitting almost asleep in one of the chairs. She stopped in front of him and waited, and after a minute he opened his eyes and smiled at her. "Look," she said, the words coming before she thought of them. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for a young man who came up this way about 10 in the morning. Did you see him?" And she began her description. "Tall, blue suit, carrying a bunch of flowers." The old man began to nod before she was finished. "I saw him," he said. "Friend of yours?" "Yes," she said, and smiled back involuntarily. The old man blinked his eyes and said, "I remember I thought, you're going to see your girl, young fellow." "They all go to see their girls," he said, and shook his head tolerantly. "Which way did he go?" "Straight on up the avenue." "That's right," the old man said. "Got a shine, had his flowers, all dressed up, in an awful hurry. You got a girl, I thought." "Thank you," she said, fumbling in her pocket for her loose change. "She sure must have been glad to see him, the way he looked," the old man said. "Thank you," she said again, and brought her hand empty from her pocket. For the first time, she was really sure he'd be waiting for her, and she hurried up the 3 blocks, the skirt of the print dress swinging under her coat, and turned into her own block. From the corner, she couldn't see her own windows. She couldn't see Jamie looking out, waiting for her. And going down the block, she was almost running to get to him. Her key trembled in her fingers at the downstairs door, and as she glanced into the drugstore, she thought of her panic. Drinking coffee there this morning, and almost laughed. At her own door, she could wait no longer, but began to say, "Jamie, I'm here. I was so worried," even before the door was open. Her own apartment was waiting for her, silent, barren, afternoon shadows lengthening from the window. For a minute she saw only the empty coffee cup, thought, "He's been here waiting," before she recognized it as her own, left from the morning. She looked all over the room, into the closet, into the bathroom. "I never saw him," the clerk in the drugstore said. "I know because I would have noticed the flowers. No one like that's been in." The old man at the shoe shine stand woke up again to see her standing in front of him. "Hello again," he said, and smiled. Are you sure?" she demanded. "Did he go up the avenue?" "I watched him," the old man said, dignified against her tone. "I thought, there's a young man's got a girl, and I watched him right into the house." "What house?" she said remotely. "Right there," the old man said. He leaned forward to point. "The next block." "With his flowers and his shine and going to see his girl right into her house." "Which one?" she said. "About the middle of the block," the old man said. He looked at her with suspicion and said, "What are you trying to do anyway?" She almost ran without stopping to say thank you. Up on the next block, she walked quickly, searching the houses from the outside to see if Jamie looked from a window, listening to hear his laughter somewhere inside. A woman was sitting in front of one of the houses, pushing a baby carriage monotonously back and forth the length of her arm. The baby inside slept, moving back and forth. The question was fluent by now. "I'm sorry, but did you see a young man go into one of these houses about 10 this morning? He was tall, wearing a blue suit, carrying a bunch of flowers." The boy of 12 stopped to listen, turning intently from one to the other, occasionally glancing at the baby. "Listen," the woman said tiredly, "the kid has his bath at 10. Would I see strange men walking around? I ask you." "Big bunch of flowers?" the boy asked, pulling at her coat. "Big bunch of flowers? I seen him, missus." She looked down and the boy grinned insolently at her. "Which house did he go in?" she asked wearily. "You gonna divorce him?" the boy asked insistently. "That's not nice to ask the lady," the woman rocking the carriage said. "Listen," the boy said, "I seen him. He went in there." He pointed to the house next door. "I followed him," the boy said. "He give me a quarter." The boy dropped his voice to a growl and said, "This is a big day for me, kid," he says. "Give me a quarter." She gave him a $1 bill. "Where?" she said. "Top floor," the boy said. "I followed him till he give me the quarter. Way to the top." He backed up the sidewalk, out of reach with the $1 bill. "You gonna divorce him?" he asked again. "Was he carrying flowers?" "Yeah," the boy said. He began to screech. "You gonna divorce him, missus? You got something on him?" He went careening down the street howling, "She's got something on the poor guy," and the woman rocking the baby laughed. The street door of the apartment house was unlocked. There were no bells in the outer vestibule and no lists of names. The stairs were narrow and dirty. There were 2 doors on the top floor. The front one was the right one. There was a crumpled florist's paper on the floor outside the door and a knotted paper ribbon like a clue, like the final clue in the paper chase. She knocked and thought she heard voices inside, and she thought suddenly with terror, "What shall I say if Jamie's here, if he comes to the door?" The voices seemed suddenly still. She knocked again and there was silence, except for something that might have been laughter, far away. "He could have seen me from the window," she thought. "It's the front apartment, and that little boy made a dreadful noise." She waited and knocked again, but there was silence. Finally, she went to the other door on the floor and knocked. The door swung open beneath her hand and she saw the empty attic room, bare lath on the walls, floorboards unpainted. She stepped just inside, looking around. The room was filled with bags of plaster, piles of old newspapers, a broken trunk. There was a noise which she suddenly realized was a rat. And then she saw it, sitting very close to her, near the wall, its evil face alert, bright eyes watching her. She stumbled in her haste to be out with the door closed, and the skirt of the print dress caught and tore. She knew there was someone inside the other apartment, because she was sure she could hear low voices and sometimes laughter. She came back many times, every day for the first week. She came on her way to work in the mornings, in the evenings, on her way to dinner alone. But no matter how often or how firmly she knocked, no one ever came to the door.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do they come back?
So I'm going to talk about the story now. I'm going to say something briefly about Shirley Jackson, although we've spoken about her many times, and so there's probably not going to be a lot of detail in that. Please remember, though, you don't have to listen to this. If you're just the kind of person who wants to hear the story without any commentary or anything like that, I put together compilations, and if you go on YouTube, you will see on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, there's a playlist called Sleep Stories, because I understand that a lot of people use these stories to fall asleep to. So they have no commentaries. Also, they have adverts at the beginning and the end, but not during. So you shouldn't be interrupted in your slumbers. If you want to listen to me talking, please do. If you want no ads at all, because both the podcast hosts, Spotify and YouTube, place ads on the website, and they're very kindly giving me a cut of that, which allows me to make a living doing it. I've given up my nursing, or I will have done in 3 weeks, and so I'm all in on creating stories for you. So it's a bit precarious, but that's what I want to do. So thanks to Spotify, thanks to YouTube. But if you don't want ads, then you can go to and become a Patreon. That's what I would suggest. So go to www.patreon.com/Barcud, which is BARCUD. That'll take you to me. You sign up there, I think for $5 a month, you get a library of all the stories I've ever done, which is hours and hours of them. You can download them. You can remix them, put techno beat tracks to them. You can put them in little cartoons on Instagram. You do what you want with them, as long as you give me credit, of course. You say Tony Walker did this, but that's so. If you just want to go to sleep, go to the Sleep Stories playlist on YouTube. If you want no ads, go to become a Patreon. Is there any other? If you just don't want to hear me at all, just press stop now. Okay, you hear Ruby in the background. Anyway. After that preamble, let's talk about The Demon Lover by Shirley Jackson. A very American story, but done in my English accent. So anyway, Shirley Jackson was born in 1916, and if you didn't know, she was a renowned American author, known for her thought-provoking and often unsettling works of fiction. So this and many of her other stories end up on American literature courses, and lots of students have to ponder over them. Well, don't you bother thinking, because I'm going to do your thinking for you, and I'm going to digest it and give it back to you. That's kind of disgusting, isn't it? But you then can just steal my ideas and put it in your term papers. I believe you call them that. We used to call them essays. Anyway, Shirley Jackson, born 1916, renowned American author. Already said that. Jackson's personal life was as enigmatic and unconventional as her writing. She was known for her eccentric personality, her interest in the occult. Whether that was so serious or a joke, but I think it was. I've read stuff that says, she seriously was interested in witchcraft and things, and her rebellious attitude towards the societal norms of her time. Jackson's fascination with witchcraft and magic led her to claim she was a practicing witch, a statement that only added to her mysterious and controversial reputation. Her marriage to literary critic Stanley Edgar Hyman was marked by intellectual collaboration and mutual support, but also by Hyman's infidelities and Jackson's struggles with mental health and substance abuse. Despite the challenges she faced, Jackson maintained a prolific writing career, producing a wide range of novels, short stories and essays that continue to captivate and unsettle readers to this day. Her unorthodox lifestyle, combined with her literary prowess, made her a unique and influential figure in the world of American literature. Very true. I was thinking about why she's so good. I rate her. Now, we've got to talk about differences in taste.
I did a Robert E. Howard story, and I've done a few kind of pulp stories of gung-ho, and some people love them, some people love this. Maybe the people who love the pulp hate this. Maybe the people who, you know where I'm going with that. So all I say is live and let live. You know, if you don't like this particular story, you don't have to listen to it. If you don't like the Robert E. Howard, you don't have to listen to it. But I think the unique thing that I feel empowered to do on this podcast is to kind of present all sorts of. It's called the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, but of course, and we could argue that Jamie in this story is a ghost in some sense, so we can stretch it a bit. But it allows me to present stories from a whole range, you know, ghost stories, horror stories, weird tales, speculative fiction, all sorts of stuff. So it's pretty good. Anyway, let's talk about The Demon Lover, first published in 1949 as part of Shirley Jackson's, hard to say that. So is Shoeshine. I don't know if you noticed, I had to have a few takes of that. The Shoeshine Man, I'm thinking, that can't be right. It sounds like somebody's got a mouth full of mashed potatoes, you know. Shirley Jackson, got it right. Short story collection, The Lottery and Other Stories. The collection, which included 24 other stories, was, apart from The Lottery, was the only one published during Jackson's lifetime. Interestingly, don't know if you knew this, the character, you maybe did, the character of James Harris appears in several other stories within the collection, including Like Mother Used to Make, Elizabeth, and Of Course. This recurring character has led to speculation among literary scholars and readers about Jackson's intentions. Some believe that James Harris represents a unifying theme or archetype that ties the stories together, perhaps embodying the idea of demon lover, or, this is it, the alluring yet elusive masculine figure that haunts the lives of the female protagonists. He certainly does in this story. You may have your own views about whether that's a good thing. I suspect most of you have come to the conclusion it's not. But, you know, some of you might be like, yeah, that demon lover thing works for me. I want a James Harris in my life. I don't think I've got room for James Harris in my life, to be fair. I don't know how I would explain Sheila after all these years. But, you know, people change. This recurring character has led to speculation among we've done that. Alluring, masculine, elusive. Others have suggested that Jackson may have been exploring the concept of a trickster figure, a character who appears in various guises and serves to challenge or subvert the expectations of both the characters and the readers. So the trickster archetype figure is a big thing in Native American literature, also monkey in Chinese literature, Loki in Norse. You could argue, at the risk of treading on thin ice, not intending to offend anyone, that Satan is a bit of a trickster in Christian stories. Got to be careful the word you use there. Let me drink a cup of tea. So, you know, but I think the idea of a trickster is quite a modern thing. Jung talks about the trickster, but I think it's a 20th century idea. I'm not convinced that he is a trickster figure, but I've been wrong before. I was walking along the street today thinking about rehearsing this little bit here because I'd recorded this story and I had to go out. I came back and it was relatively sunny. It's clouded over now, and I was thinking about how I was going to do it, and I've forgotten what I was thinking now. Well, that's hard when you've got a brain like mine. It's like a sieve. Things run through the holes in the bottom. Oh yeah, I was thinking about offending people. No, I wasn't thinking about offending people in the sense of planning to offend people. I was thinking, you know, about debate. And so I say, you say, that, oh, I think James Harris is a trickster figure. And I go, come off it, old bean. Of course, and then I put a counter proposition. And you say, well, and then in the end I maybe go, oh, do you know what? I see your point. And at no point do we murder each other, burn each other's houses down, stick pins in our eyes. It's called debate, and we're not offended. It's like, I have a view that you don't necessarily agree with. That doesn't mean you must die. So let's not be offended. People do get offended. And of course, I think the other thing I think about social media is, and of course YouTube and all that is social media, is that it's a numbers game. So the more you put your your thoughts out there into the world of social media, and hatred is cost free pretty much on social media. You can slag somebody off, you can say vicious, vile things about them with no comeback, and so it's numbers. The more people hear it, the more of those kind of people you are going to trigger, if that's the right word, set alight with your. Imagine the fireworks and you write like a little blue paper, the touch paper. You're going to do that. But and they are loud voices and they create a big emotional impact. And this is a lesson I have to learn, that they're a very small number. And most people I really kind of hope and believe this is true. Most people are reasonable, most people are decent, most people are basically kind. There are a few of these people who aren't, but there are not many of them. It's just because they've got loud voices. So that is relevant, I think. Maybe they're trickster figures. Oh yeah. Okay. The recurrence of the James Harris, we'll get back to James Harris now, throughout the lottery and other stories serves to deepen the collection's thematic and psychological complexity. Let's think about her use of the word daemon, spelled D-A-E-M-O-N. It's a fascinating choice because in Greek mythology, the daemon, spelled like that, or D-A-I-M-O-N, was a divine or semi-divine spirit that acted as an intermediary between gods and humans. Socrates famously claimed to have a personal demon that provided him with moral and spiritual guidance. And Socrates, why didn't he leave rather than drink the hemlock and get murdered? Because the daemon told him to drink it. The daemon said, this is the right thing to do, so he did do it. And it wasn't demonic and evil, it was a moral guardian. So she chooses to use daemon rather than demon. And this is it makes the so James Harris is the demon lover. So basically, these stories, the demon lover is a ballad, a Scots ballad, and he is a demon there. He's this wicked, evil male. But in this, she's chosen to use the Greek rather than the medieval Christian view of what a demon is. Okay, that's just an idea. All right. This interpretation is further supported by the work of Patrick Harper, H-A-R-P-U-R. Now, I love Patrick Harper, and if you dig on YouTube, you'll see him talking. He's a very decent, thoughtful man, and I don't think he realises his influence on those who are interested. His cultural influence is bigger than he seems to think. You maybe haven't come across him, but you maybe have. I think he's fantastic. I'm very interested in all that stuff. Of ultra-terrestrials, John Keel, the fairy folk, all that kind of thing. So Patrick Harper has written extensively about the role of demons in mythology, daemons in mythology, literature and depth psychology. Harper argues that daemons are not merely literary devices or superstitious beliefs, but rather powerful archetypal forces that reflect the hidden depths of the human psyche. I think it's important to say he at least grants them, as Carl Jung did, autonomous existence. They aren't just symbols, they are people. They have personalities. In The Demon Lover, Jamie Harris can be understood as a manifestation of the protagonist's own inner demon. Get this, a figure that embodies her deepest fears, desires and potential for transformation. By confronting and ultimately embracing this demon, the protagonist may be able to achieve a greater sense of self-awareness. So, and if you read conventional analyses of this story, it's seen through a feminist lens. I'm not saying that isn't true, but it's seen, in the 1950s, particularly women. You've read the story, as you were hearing the story, you will have been aware of this, that this is the role of the 50s, 60s housewife, the trad wife. All her aspirations for life are through marriage and the man. And so, in a sense, she's projecting her own potential onto another figure who turns out to be illusory. He's not real. So we could argue that by putting all her hope for her future in a man in this case, she is, I was going to say emasculating herself, and of course that's actually ironic and not completely accurate. But do you know what I mean? But it's interesting I chose that word. And so she is disempowering herself when you read the commentaries on this story, you know, the classic analysis, as I said, is a feminist one, but people have said it's not just that, because although in this case she is a woman, and it is a female situation, from that time, maybe not so much from this time, but it's also true of us all, in that as long as we pin our hopes on a figure external to ourselves to create our own happiness and our own and realize our own potential, we will never do it ourselves in many ways. I mean, you can argue with that, and this is just a tentative idea. It's like what I was saying before. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. I'm not sure I agree with myself. I'm just kind of surfacing these ideas, okay? Now, there's lots and lots of interesting things in this story. One of the things I thought about was how she starts off, he doesn't turn up, she goes to his flat. He often wears a blue suit, usually wears a blue suit because he is wearing a blue suit in her description. He may have a bunch of flowers. In the end, she's describing him with a bunch of flowers, and so I think the interesting thing here is how this figure that she's looking for, this description, is imagined by herself, which of course underlines the theme we've just been talking about, that this is an imaginary creature. And of course the idea is potentially we don't know if she hasn't completely imagined him, if her desire for that marriage with this idealized man has made her imagine him completely. And some people say she's psychotic. I don't think we need to bring that into it. You know, at the end, she goes and knocks on the door, which is never answered, which is really interesting and effective as well. And also the door that does open is an empty room. Yeah, come on, that's unfurnished. There is nothing to recommend it. This is almost like at the end she has a choice between two rooms, one that is never open to her, and in that room is her idealized man living this ideal life with his other woman that he's taken flowers to. He's gone to see his other girl, you know, so that is the life that she wants, which she's locked out from. And then the one she gets is this empty, barren attic, you know. So that kind of is a picture of her fate. Yeah, so I was saying about her imagination, how she creates that. And also in this walk, when I was walking down, I was thinking, and this has been my life work, if you like, professionally. Everybody I see who sees me as a mental health professional, most of their problems arise from these imaginary worlds. So what I mean by that is people can be crippled with anxiety and depression by trying to live up to shoulds and oughts that they or society, or they've been given it by society. You should be this kind of person. You ought to have achieved this. You know, and as human beings, as a pack animal, how we manage the behaviour of others around them is by injecting emotion into them. So what we do is we create a series of rules and we say you ought to do this. So in one culture you might be expected to do this, in another culture you might be expected to do that. And if you don't do what our peers think we should do, we feel guilt and shame, and so we control other people by giving them guilt and shame. And most of the people I've ever seen have been unhappy. It's because of two things. One is they have not lived up to what they feel they ought to have done, and so they feel guilt and shame. They feel worthless. Depression, that's a root of depression. I feel worthless. I would say to people, so what are you for? And they would say, I don't know. And that's depression. That's almost diagnostic of depression. Somebody who does not know their purpose and they feel they have no purpose. But that's usually just because they're not being the person that shoulds and oughts that told them to be. And then, of course, the anger is the flip side of that. That's because my family, my friends didn't do what I think they should and ought to have done. They are happily, so I resent and I'm angry at them. I've played the game. I have not been dealt fairly with, and what that means is they did not play their part. They should have done that. They didn't do it. So I'm angry. Yeah, you get cut up in traffic. He should have waited for me. You know, at the wedding, I should have been allowed to sit at the front seat. You know, in the inheritance, my brother John should have. You know, and so we're either, if it's us, we feel guilty and depressed, And if we feel that we have not been played with, we have not been treated fairly, that is to say, the others have not fulfilled their shoulds and oughts, we feel angry at them, you know. So that's true, and that's what she's doing. And the other thing is, if you think about how stories work, we as human beings, we have this capacity of, and we spend most of our conscious life in the past or the future. We imagine future situations, or we remember past situations. Both of those are now imaginary, they're not present. And we have the capacity, when we imagine a happy scene, we feel happy. When we remember a sad scene, we feel sad. Stories do this. So somebody with their words or their pictures or a smell can create an imaginary scene, and we feel all the emotions of that imaginary scene. So drama does this. So we go to a horror movie and we feel scared. We go to a love story, we feel lovey-dovey. It's a technical term. We go to a war story. We see, you know, Lord of the Rings, and Theoden's got his knights and they're about to charge down. Death, 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 you know, and that is the way of the warrior. We feel, I guess we all do, but men particularly are prone to that. Yes, we're going to fulfill our honour, our duty. These are like shoulds and oughts as well. I'm not saying they're wrong, but you know, we have responsibility. I've got to clarify that. We have responsibility to ourselves and to others. We don't live. I was reading a book called The Anatomy of Genres by John Truby, and he talks about the action story being the way of the warrior, which is the solitary way, or a solitary hero. But all of us really, although we have to put up with the shoulds and oughts of society around us, I do believe, you know, you may disagree, that we have a responsibility to others and our society and our family. And now, I've said this before, and some people say, my family treated me shamefully. Well, of course, every case differs, and I'm not making a prescription for you. You know, your life is not my life. But in general terms, we have a duty to be kind to our neighbours, unless blah 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 blah, unless they transgress on the shoulds and oughts, unless they do things they shouldn't and oughtn't, in which case we'll become angry at them, we will want to destroy them. Oh, that's just me. So anyway, where were we? So yeah, and so listen, I know it's not you who I'm talking to, but there's those kind of, some people read billionaire alpha werewolf stories, and when the hero rips off his shirt and he has his rippling 8-pack and his biceps and all that kind of stuff, they feel a little tingle. Yeah? And that's just the same thing as the war stories and the love stories and the horror stories. So the power of the imagination is to recreate emotions. I can't remember where I was going with that, but I still think it's true. So a good story does do that. That's my final point, because I've gone on a little bit, is Jackson's weirdness. So I think there was a mid-century, after the second half of the 20th century, there were a number of writers who created existential unease. And what I mean by that is, we have earlier on, we have Bruno Schulz, we have Franz Kafka, and they and this whole surrealist movement, which they're sort of related to, whereby they create situations that begin in the normal, everyday, quotidien, and they push it, and they make it strange. And because it's strange, it's unnerving. There's a guy called Carl Friston who has this theory about anxiety and entropy. When things are predictable, we don't feel anxiety. When they become entropic, we can't predict them, we become anxious. So we rely on cues to show that the world is in its place and it's predictable. So, and but somebody gives the example. You're driving to work, you go to work every day, you drive these many miles, you know where you start, you know where you stop, you've got enough petrol in your car, and everything's fine. And you're pretty relaxed. You know how things are going to be. Then you break down on the side of the motorway, freeway, and the autobahn, the autostrada. Oh God, forget it. There's enough of those. And you become anxious because entropy has suddenly exploded in your life. And so if you have a story and everything's right and everything's familiar, the drugstore, the florist, the apartment, the cups of coffee, and then it starts to get slightly strange. And we don't know how to predict it because this is different. We become anxious. And so I think, as I was saying, Kafka, Bruno Schultz, they push it. So it's really weird. You turn into a beetle, that's not really normal. I've never met anybody who's turned into a beetle. Well, I don't think so. Oh yeah, there was Jeff. He was a dentist. No, that's not true. I made that up. I did know a guy called Jeff who was a dentist. But no, he's Dewi. Dewi and Jeff. Jeff was a teacher. Anyway, yes, I can get a bit lost in these things. So, and then we have Shirley Jackson. Let's talk about Robert Aikman as well. I'm burning to do another Aikman story. So Aikman takes the drab post-war Britain, you know, ringing the changes in this drab seaside town. If you've been in Britain, you've been to one of those. Or the hospice, where he stops at this very ordinary, like a Toby Carvery almost, but it's just weird. That is pretty weird. He puts some very weird things in there. Some of them don't go as weird, and he just leaves us unsettled. This great unsettlement. I think Jackson does that as well. There's a visit, isn't there? And if you that is pretty weird. But this is not so weird. This is almost every day. It's just pushed a little bit off, so it becomes odd. You know, this man. Nobody's saying he doesn't exist. The couple is the Rycrofts. But it's weird. They've let this man borrow their apartment. They know nothing about him. That's not right, is it? That's not right. And then the rest of the stuff is just slightly wrong. The man, you know, and the fact that she behaves oddly, although, you know, we can behave oddly sometimes. And she goes knocking on this door, this stranger, and what's she going to say to him? So I think what she does is she takes the everyday, the ordinary, the drugstore, all of that stuff, the shoe shine, which was very normal for them, and pushes it and just makes it unsettling. And I think she's so great at that. If you listen to The Haunting of Hill House, at the beginning, Eleanor is living a life very much like this woman. Not with a demon lover, but this suburban, small-town, mid-century American woman with aspirations for a better life, who finds herself in a deadening, drab world that is so ordinary, it's drained her of everything, and both of them are looking forward to an escape from this. Eleanor goes to Hill House, big mistake, and this lady here in the blue dress, do we ever get a name for her? You know, if we do, I've got a mental blank. And so I'm not sure we do. Yeah, do we? Yeah, anyway, you know how it goes. I'm tired. I always say that. That's my excuse. And so there we are. And yeah, and like Aikman, taking the everyday drabness of mid-century Western culture and making us very anxious, and also by making it odd, so it becomes unpredictable. But both of them, and particularly Jackson, I think, she reaches into ourselves and finds that deep disquiet with our lives. I went to see a Pink Floyd tribute band, you know, the other week. They were really good. And there's that line from Dark Side of the Moon. Is it from Brie? And it's like hanging on in quiet desperation is the English way. Maybe not just the English way. Hanging on in quiet desperation. And I think that ennui suffuses so many of Jackson's stories, particularly the stories set in bland, nondescript American suburbia or cities, but not the city centres, nothing exciting going on. Also, another guy I want to mention is Ray Bradbury. I think Bradbury does this as well. There's a story I've done on this called The Crowd, which is normal but weird. Yeah. So there we are. Anyway, I'll wrap up now. The story is clear. You could argue it's a ghost story, that Jamie Harris is a ghost. I'm not going to argue because I don't think that's the case. but it's certainly a weird tale, and I think I've already established that the Classic Ghost Stories podcast does weird tales. I hope you really enjoyed the story. Jackson, I think it's my final point now, is that when we have a good writer, it just stimulates so many thoughts and ways of thinking about the story. And there is such a richness even in such a short story. There's so much in it. And I think that is a tribute. You will know that I'm a big admirer of Shirley Jackson. I'm also a big admirer of Edith Wharton. I think some of her weirder tales are also. The Pomegranate Seed I love. I know Todd hates it, but I really like it for that similar reason. And of course Daphne du Maurier as well. Daphne isn't weird like this, but Daphne's more gothic. But she also, particularly with the birds and Don't Look Now at the end. And I think if you saw the 1970s film with not Kiefer Sutherland, Donald Sutherland, Kiefer's dad, and Julie Christie, that whole Venice scene, particularly the Scottish psychic twins, that has this unnerving weirdness about it. So she's not the only one, but she's very good, I think. And Lottery, of course, as well. I could talk about her all day. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be quiet now. You've heard enough from me, as I'm sure you'd agree. Right. Yeah, remember to sign up as a Patreon. Go on. Or you could buy me a coffee. Yeah, there should be a link somewhere. You could buy me a coffee if you don't want to sign up to. Because remember, I'm doing this for a living now, so I'm slightly anxious about it. But it'll be fine.
Thurnley Abbey, written by Percival Landon and narrated by Tony Walker. 3 years ago, I was on my way out to the east, and, as an extra day in London was of some importance, I took the Friday evening mail train to Brindisi instead of the usual Thursday morning Marseille Express. Many people shrink from the long 48-hour train journey through Europe and the subsequent rush across the Mediterranean on the 19-knot Isis or Osiris. But there is really very little discomfort on either the train or the mailboat. And unless there is actually nothing for me to do, I always like to save the extra day and a half in London before I say goodbye to her for one of my longer tramps. This time, it was early, I remember, in the shipping season, probably about the beginning of September. There were few passengers, and I had a compartment in the P&O Indian Express to myself all the way from Calais. All Sunday I watched the blue waves dimpling the Adriatic, and the pale rosemary along the cuttings, the plain white towns with their flat roofs and their bold duomos, and the grey-green gnarled olive orchards of Apulia. The journey was just like any other. We ate in the dining car as often and as long as we decently could. We slept after luncheon. We dawdled the afternoon away with yellow-backed novels. Sometimes we exchanged platitudes in the smoking room. And it was there that I met Alistair Colvin. Colvin was a man of middle height, with a resolute, well-cut jaw. His hair was turning grey. His moustache was sun-whitened. Otherwise, he was clean-shaven. Obviously a gentleman, and obviously also a preoccupied man. He had no great wit, but when spoken to, he made the usual remarks in the right way, and I dare say he refrained from banalities only because he spoke less than the rest of us. Most of the time, he buried himself in the Wagon League Company's timetable, but seemed unable to concentrate his attention on any one page of it. He found that I had been over the Siberian Railway, and for a quarter of an hour he discussed it with me. Then he lost interest in it, and rose to go to his compartment. But he came back again very soon, and seemed glad to pick up the conversation again. Of course, this did not seem to me to be of any importance. Most travellers by train become a trifle infirm of purpose after 36 hours rattling. But Colvin's restless way I noticed in somewhat marked contrast with the man's personal importance and dignity. Especially ill-suited was it to his finely made large hand with strong, broad, regular nails and its few lines,
As I looked at his hand, I noticed a long, deep and recent scar of ragged shape. However, it is absurd to pretend that I thought anything was unusual. I went off at 5 o'clock on Sunday afternoon to sleep away the hour or two that had still to be got through before we arrived at Brindisi. Once there, we few passengers transshipped our hand baggage, verified our berths, there were only a score of us all in all, and then, after an aimless ramble of half an hour in Brindisi, we returned to dinner at the Hotel International, not wholly surprised that the town had been the death of Virgil. If I remember rightly, there is a gaily painted hall at the International. I do not wish to advertise anything, but there is no other place in Brindisi at which to await the coming of the mail. And after dinner, I was looking with awe at a trellis overgrown with blue vines, when Colvin moved across the room to my table. He picked up Il Secolo, but almost immediately gave up the pretense of reading it. He turned squarely to me and said, "Would you do me a favour?" One doesn't do favours to stray acquaintances on continental expresses without knowing something more of them than I knew of Colvin. But I smiled in a non-committal way and asked him what he wanted. I wasn't wrong in part of my estimate of him. He said bluntly, "Will you let me sleep in your cabin on the Osiris?" And he coloured a little as he said it. Now, there is nothing more tiresome than having to put up with a stable companion at sea, and I asked him, rather pointedly, "Surely there's room for all of us?" I thought that perhaps he had been partnered off with some mangy Levantine, and wanted to escape from him at all hazards. Colvin, still somewhat confused, said, "Yes, I'm in a cabin by myself, but you would do me the greatest favour if you would allow me to share yours." This was all very well, but beside the fact that I always sleep better when alone, there had been some recent thefts on board English liners, and I hesitated. Frank and honest and self-conscious as Colvin was. Just then the mail train came in with a clatter and a rush of escaping steam, and I asked him to see me again about it on the boat when we started. He answered me curtly. I suppose he saw the mistrust in my manner. "I am a member of White's." I smiled to myself as he said it, but I remembered in a moment that the man, if he were really what he claimed to be, and I make no doubt that he was, must have been sorely put to it before he urged the fact as a guarantee of his respectability to a total stranger at a Brindisi hotel. That evening, as we cleared the red and green harbour lights of Brindisi, Colvin explained. This is his story, in his own words. "When I was travelling in India some years ago, I made the acquaintance of a youngish man in the woods and forests. We camped out together for a week, and I found him a pleasant companion. John Broughton was a light-hearted soul when off duty, but a steady and capable man in any of the small emergencies that continually arise in that department. He was liked and trusted by the natives, and though a trifle overpleased with himself when he escaped to civilization at Simla or Calcutta, Broughton's future was well assured in government service when a fair-sized estate was unexpectedly left to him, and he joyfully shook the dust of the Indian plains from his feet and returned to England. For 5 years he drifted about London. I saw him now and then. We dined together about every 18 months, and I could trace pretty exactly the gradual sickening of Broughton with a merely idle life. He then set out on a couple of long voyages, and returned as restless as before, and at last told me that he had decided to marry and settle down at his place, Thurnley Abbey, which had long been empty. He spoke about looking after the property and standing for his constituency in the usual way. Vivian Wilde, his fiancée, had, I suppose, begun to take him in hand. She was a pretty girl, with a deal of fair hair and a rather exclusive manner, deeply religious in a narrow school. She was still kindly and high-spirited, and I thought that Broughton was in luck. He was quite happy and full of information about his future. Among other things, I asked him about Thurnley Abbey. He confessed that he hardly knew the place. The last tenant, a man called Clark, had lived in one wing for 15 years and seen no one. He had been a miser and a hermit. It was the rarest thing for a light to be seen in the abbey after dark, Only the barest necessities of life were ordered, and the tenant himself received them at the side door. His one half-caste manservant, after a month's stay in the house, had abruptly left without warning and had returned to the southern states. One thing Broughton complained bitterly about: Clark had wilfully spread the rumour among the villagers that the abbey was haunted, and had even consented to play childish tricks with spirit lamps and salt in order to scare trespassers away at night. He had been detected in the act of his tomfoolery, but the story spread, and no one, said Broughton, would venture near the house except in broad daylight. The hauntedness of Fernley Abbey was now, he said with a grin, part of the gospel of the countryside. But he and his young wife were going to change all that. Would I propose myself any time I liked? I, of course, said I would, and equally, of course, intended to do nothing of the sort without a definite invitation. House was put in thorough repair, though not a stick of the old furniture and tapestry were removed. Floors and ceilings were relaid, the roof was made watertight again, and the dust of half a century was scoured out. He showed me some photographs of the place. It was called an abbey, though, as a matter of fact, it had only been the infirmary of the long-vanished Abbey of Gloucester, some 5 miles away. The larger part of this building remained as it had been in pre-Reformation days, but a wing had been added in Jacobean times, and that part of the house had been kept in something like repair by Mr. Clark. He had, in both the ground and first floors, set a heavy timber door, strongly barred with iron, in the passage between the earlier and the Jacobean parts of the house, and had entirely neglected the former, so there had been a good deal of work to be done. Broughton, whom I saw in London 2 or 3 times about this period, made a deal of fun over the positive refusal of the workmen to remain after sundown. Even after the electric light had been put into every room, nothing would induce them to remain, though, as Broughton observed, electric light was death on ghosts. The legend of the Abbey's ghosts had gone far and wide, and the men would take no risks. They went home in batches of 5 and 6, and even during the daylight hours there was an inordinate amount of talking between one and another, if either happened to be out of sight of his companion. On the whole, though, nothing of any sort or kind had been conjured up even by their heated imagination during their 5 months' work upon the Abbey. The belief in ghosts was rather strengthened than otherwise in Thurnley because of the men's confessed nervousness, and local tradition declared itself in favour of the ghost of an immured nun. "Good old nun," said Broughton. I asked him whether in general he believed in the possibility of ghosts, and rather to my surprise, he said that he couldn't say he entirely disbelieved in them. A man in India had told him one morning in camp that he believed that his mother was dead in England, as her vision had come to his tent the night before. He had not been alarmed, but had said nothing, and then the figure vanished again. As a matter of fact, the next possible dakwala brought on a telegram announcing the mother's death. There the thing was, said Broughton, but at Thurnley he was practical enough. He roundly cursed the idiotic selfishness of Clark, whose silly antics had caused all the inconvenience. At the same time, he couldn't refuse to sympathize, to some extent, with the ignorant workman. "My own idea," said he, "is that if a ghost ever does come in one's way, we ought to speak to it." I agreed. Little as I knew of the ghost world and its conventions, I had always remembered that a spook was in honour bound to wait to be spoken to. It didn't seem much to do, and I felt that the sound of one's own voice would at any rate reassure oneself as to one's wakefulness. But there are few ghosts outside Europe, few, that is, that any white man can see, and I have never been troubled with any. However, as I have said, I told Broughton that I agreed. So the wedding took place, and I went to it in a tall hat which I bought for the occasion, and the new Mrs. Broughton smiled very nicely at me afterwards. As it had to happen, I took the Orient Express that evening, and was not in England again for nearly 6 months. Just before I came back, I got a letter from Broughton. He asked if I could come to see him in London or come to Thurnley, as he thought I should be better able to help him than anyone else he knew. His wife sent a nice message to me at the end, so I was reassured about at least one thing. I wrote from Budapest that I would come and see him at Thornley 2 days after my arrival in London. And as I sauntered out of the Pannonia into the Kerepesi Utsa to post my letters, I wondered of what earthly service I could be to Broughton. I had been out with him after Tiger on foot, and I could imagine few men better able at a pinch to manage their own business. However, I had nothing to do, so after dealing with some small accumulations of business during my absence, I packed a kit bag and departed to Euston. I was met by Broughton's great limousine at Thornley Road Station, and after a drive of nearly 7 miles, we echoed through the sleepy streets of Thornley village, into which the main gates of the park thrust themselves, splendid with pillars and spread eagles and tomcats rampant atop of them. I never was a herald, but I know that the Broughtons have the right to support us, though heaven knows why. From the gates, a quadruple avenue of beech trees led inwards for a quarter of a mile. Beneath them, a neat strip of fine turf edged the road and ran back until the poison of the dead beech leaves killed it under the trees. There were many wheel tracks on the road, and a comfortable little pony trap jogged past me, laden with a country parson and his wife and daughter. Evidently, there was some garden party going on at the Abbey. The road dropped away to the right at the end of the avenue, and I could see the Abbey across a wide pasturage and a broad lawn thickly dotted with guests. The end of the building was plain. It must have been almost mercilessly austere when it was first built, but time had crumbled the edges and toned the stone down into an orange lichened grey wherever it showed behind its curtain of magnolia, jasmine and ivy. Farther on was the 3-storied Jacobean house, tall and handsome. There had not been the slightest attempt to adapt the one to the other, but the kindly ivy had glossed over the touching point. There was a tall fleche in the middle of the building, surmounting a small bell tower. Behind the house there rose the mountainous verdure of Spanish chestnuts all the way up the hill. Broughton had seen me coming from afar, and walked across from his other guests to welcome me, before turning me over to the butler's care. This man was sandy-haired and rather inclined to be talkative. He could, however, answer hardly any questions about the house. He had, he said, only been there 3 weeks. Mindful of what Broughton had told me, I made no inquiries about ghosts, though the room into which I was shown might have justified anything. It was a very large, low room, with oak beams projecting from the white ceiling. Every inch of the walls, including the doors, was covered with tapestry, and a remarkably fine Italian 4-post bedstead, heavily draped, added to the darkness and dignity of the place. All the furniture was old, well-made and dark. Underfoot there was a plain green pile carpet. The only new thing about the room, except the electric light fittings and the jugs and basins. Even the looking-glass on the dressing table was an old pyramidal Venetian glass, set in a heavy repoussé frame of tarnished silver. After a few minutes cleaning up, I went downstairs and out upon the lawn, where I greeted my hostess. The people gathered there were of the usual country type, all anxious to be pleased, and roundly curious as to the new master of the Abbey. Rather to my surprise, and quite to my pleasure, I rediscovered Glenham, whom I had known well in the old days in Barotseland. He lived quite close by, as he remarked with a grin. I ought to have known. But, he added, I don't live in a place like this. He swept his hand to the long, low lines of the Abbey in obvious admiration, and then, to my intense interest, muttered beneath his breath, "Thank God." He saw that I had overheard him, and turning to me said decidedly, "Yes, thank God," I said, and I meant it. I wouldn't live at the Abbey for all Broughton's money. "But surely," I demurred, "you know that old Clark was discovered in the very act of setting light to his bugaboos." Glenham shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, I know about that. But there is something wrong with the place still. All I can say is that Broughton is a different man since he's lived here. I don't believe he'll remain much longer. But you're staying here. Well, you'll hear all about it tonight. There's a big dinner, I understand." The conversation turned off to old reminiscences, and Glenham soon after had to go. Before I went to dress that evening, I had 20 minutes' talk with Broughton in his library. There was no doubt the man was altered, gravely altered. He was nervous and fidgety, and I found him looking at me only when my eye was off him. I naturally asked him what he wanted of me. I told him I would do anything I could, but that I couldn't conceive what he lacked that I could provide. He said with a lustreless smile that there was, however, something, and that he would tell me the following morning. It struck me that he was somehow ashamed of himself, and perhaps ashamed of the part he was asking me to play. However, I dismissed the subject from my mind and went up to dress in my palatial room. As I shut the door, a draught blew out of the Queen of Sheba from the wall, and I noticed that the tapestries were not fastened to the wall at the bottom. I have always held very practical views about spooks, and it has often seemed to me that the slow waving in firelight of loose tapestry upon a wall would account for 99% of the stories one hears. Certainly the dignified undulation of this lady with her attendants and huntsmen, one of whom was untidily cutting the throat of a fallow deer upon the very steps on which King Solomon, a grey-faced Flemish nobleman with the Order of the Golden Fleece, awaited his fair visitor, gave colour to my hypothesis. Nothing much happened at dinner. The people were very much like those of the garden party. A young woman next to me seemed anxious to know what was being read in London. As she was far more familiar than I with the most recent magazines and literary supplements, I found salvation in being myself instructed in the tendencies of modern fiction. All true art, she said, was shot through and through with melancholy. How vulgar were the attempts at wit that marked so many modern books. From the beginning of literature, it had always been tragedy that embodied the highest attainment of every age. To call such works morbid merely begged the question. No thoughtful man, she looked sternly at me through the steel rim of her glasses, could fail to agree with me. Of course, as one would, I immediately and properly said that I slept with Pet Ridge and Jacobs under my pillow at night, and that if Jorrocks weren't quite so large and cornery, I would add him to the company. She hadn't read any of them, so I was saved for a time. But I remember grimly that she said that the dearest wish of her life was to be in some awful and soul-freezing situation of horror, and I remembered that she dealt hardly with the hero of Nat Painter's vampire story between nibbles at her brown bread ice. She was a cheerless soul, and I couldn't help thinking that if there were many such in the neighbourhood, it was not surprising that old Glenham had been stuffed with some nonsense or other about the Abbey. Yet nothing could well have been less creepy than the glitter of silver and glass and the subdued lights and cackle of conversation all round the dinner table. After the ladies had gone, I found myself talking to the rural dean. He was a thin, earnest man who at once turned the conversation to old Clark's buffooneries. But, he said, Mr. Broughton had introduced such a new and cheerful spirit not only into the Abbey, but, he might say, into the whole neighbourhood, that he had great hopes that the ignorant superstition of the past were from henceforth destined to oblivion. Thereupon his other neighbour, a portly gentleman of independent means and position, audibly remarked, "Amen," which dampened the rural dean, and we talked of partridges past, partridges present, and pheasants to come. At the other end of the table, Broughton sat with a couple of his friends, red-faced hunting men. Once I noticed that they were discussing me, but I paid no attention to it at the time. I remembered it a few hours later. By 11 all the guests were gone, and Broughton, his wife and I were alone together under the fine plaster ceiling of the Jacobean drawing-room. Mrs. Broughton talked about one or two of the neighbours, and then, with a smile, said that she knew I would excuse her, shook hands with me, and went off to bed. I am not very good at analysing things, but I felt that she talked a little uncomfortably, and, with a suspicion of effort, smiled rather conventionally, and was obviously glad to go. These things seemed trifling enough to repeat. but I had throughout the faint feeling that everything was not square. Under the circumstances, this was enough to set me wondering what on earth the service could be that I was to render, wondering also whether the whole business were not some ill-advised jest in order to make me come down from London for a mere shooting party. Broughton said little after she had gone, but he was evidently labouring to bring the conversation round to the so-called hauntings of the Abbey. As soon as I saw this, of course, I asked him directly about it. He then seemed at once to lose interest in the matter. There was no doubt about it. Broughton was somehow a changed man, and to my mind, he had changed in no way for the better. Mrs. Broughton seemed no sufficient cause. He was clearly fond of her, and she of him. I reminded him that he was going to tell me what I could do for him in the morning, pleaded my journey, lighted a candle, and went upstairs with him. At the end of the passage leading into the old house, he grinned weakly and said, "Mind, if you see a ghost, do talk to it. You said you would." He stood irresolutely a moment and then turned away. At the door of his dressing room he paused once more. "I'm here," he called out, "if you should want anything. Good night," and he shut his door. I went along the passage to my room, undressed, switched on the lamp beside my bed, read a few pages of the Jungle Book, and then, more than ready for sleep, turned the light off and went fast asleep. 3 hours later, I woke up. There was not a breath of wind outside. There was not even a flicker of light from the fireplace. As I lay there, an ash tinkled slightly as it cooled, but there was hardly a gleam of the dullest red in the grate. An owl cried among the silent Spanish chestnuts on the slope outside. I idly reviewed the events of the day, hoping that I should fall off to sleep again before I reached dinner, but at the end I seemed as wakeful as ever. There was no help for it. I must read my Jungle Book again till I felt ready to go off, so I fumbled for the pair at the end of the cord that hung down inside the bed, and I switched on the bedside lamp. The sudden glory dazzled me for a moment. I felt under my pillow for my book with half-shut eyes. Then, growing used to the light, I happened to look down to the foot of my bed. I can never tell you really what happened then. Nothing I could ever confess in the most abject words could even faintly picture to you what I felt. I know that my heart stopped dead and my throat shut automatically. In one instinctive movement, I crouched back up against the headboards of the bed, staring at the horror. The movement set my heart going again, and the sweat dripped from every pore. I am not a particularly religious man, but I had always believed that God would never allow any supernatural appearance to present itself to man in such a guise and in such circumstances that harm, either bodily or mental, could result to him. I can only tell you that at that moment both my life and my reason rocked unsteadily on their seats. The other Osiris passengers had gone to bed. Only he and I remained, leaning over the starboard railing, which rattled uneasily now and then under the fierce vibration of the over-engined mailboat. Far over, there were the lights of a few fishing smacks riding out the night, and a great rush of white, combing and seething water fell out and away from us overside. At last, Colvin went on. Leaning over the foot of my bed, looking at me, was a figure, swathed in a rotten and tattered veiling. This shroud passed over the head, but left both eyes and the right side of the face bare. It then followed the line of the arm down to where the hand grasped the bed end. The face was not entirely that of a skull, though the eyes and the flesh of the face were totally gone. There was a thin, dry skin drawn tightly over the features, and there was some skin left on the hand. One wisp of hair crossed the forehead. It was perfectly still. I looked at it, and it looked at me, and my brains turned dry and hot in my head. I had still got the pair of the electric lamp in my hand, and I played idly with it, If only I dared not turn out the light again. I shut my eyes, only to open them in a hideous terror the same second. The thing had not moved. My heart was thumping, and the sweat cooled me as it evaporated. Another cinder tinkled in the grate, and a panel creaked in the wall. My reason failed me. For 20 minutes, or 20 seconds, I was able to think of nothing else but this awful figure, till there came, hurtling through the empty channels of my senses, the remembrance that Broughton and his friends had discussed me furtively at dinner. The dim possibility of it being a hoax stole gratefully into my unhappy mind, and once there, one's pluck came creeping back along 1,000 tiny veins. My first sensation was one of blind, unreasoning thankfulness that my brain was going to stand the trial. I'm not a timid man, but the best of us needs some human handle to steady him in time of extremity. And in this faint but growing hope that after all it might only be a brutal hoax, I found the fulcrum that I needed. At last I moved. How I managed to do it I cannot tell you, but with one spring towards the foot of the bed, I got within arm's length and struck out one fearful blow with my fist at the thing. It crumbled under it. My hand was cut to the bone. With the sickening revulsion after my terror, I dropped half fainting across the end of the bed. So it was merely a foul trick after all. No doubt the trick had been played many a time before. No doubt Broughton and his friends had had some large bet among themselves as to what I should do when I discovered the gruesome thing. From my state of abject terror, I found myself transported into an insensate anger. I shouted curses upon Broughton. I dived rather than climbed over the bed end onto the sofa. I tore at the robed skeleton. How well the whole thing had been carried out, I thought. I broke the skull against the floor and stamped upon its dry bones. I flung the head away under the bed and rent the brittle bones of the trunk in pieces. I snapped the thin thigh bones across my knee and flung them in different directions. The shin bones I set up against a stool and broke them with my heel. I raged like a berserker against the loathly thing, and stripped the ribs from the backbone and slung the breastbone against the cupboard. My fury increased as the work of destruction went on. I tore the frail, rotten veil into 20 pieces, and the dust went up over everything, over the clean blotting paper and the silver inkstand. At last, my work was done. There was but a raffle of broken bones and strips of parchment and crumbling wool. Then, picking up a piece of the skull, it was the cheek and temple bone of the right side, I remember. I opened the door and went down the passage to Broughton's dressing room. I remember still how my sweat-dripping pyjamas clung to me as I walked. At the door I kicked and entered. Broughton was in bed. He had already turned the light on and seemed shrunken and horrified. For a moment he could hardly pull himself together. Then I spoke. I don't know what I said. Only I know that from a heart full and overfull with hatred and contempt, spurred on by shame of my own recent cowardice, I let my tongue run on. He answered nothing. I was amazed at my own fluency. My hair still clung lankily to my wet temples. My hand was bleeding profusely, and I must have looked a strange sight. Broughton huddled himself up at the end of the bed just as I had. Still he made no answer, no defence. He seemed preoccupied with something beside my reproaches, and once or twice moistened his lips with his tongue. But he could say nothing, though he moved his hands now and then, just as a baby who cannot speak moves its hands. At last the door into Mrs. Broughton's room opened, and she came in, white and terrified. "What is it? What is it? Oh, in God's name, what is it?" she cried again and again, and then she went up to her husband and sat on the bed in her nightdress, and the two faced me. I told her what the matter was. I spared her husband not a word for her presence there, yet he seemed hardly to understand. I told the pair that I had spoiled their cowardly joke for them. Broughton looked up. "I have smashed the foul thing into 100 pieces," I said. Broughton licked his lips again, and his mouth worked. "By God," I shouted, "it would serve you right if I thrashed you within an inch of your life. I will take care that not a decent man or woman of my acquaintance ever speaks to you again. And there," I added, throwing the broken piece of the skull upon the floor beside his bed, "there is a souvenir for you of your damned work tonight." Broughton saw the bone, and in a moment it was his turn to frighten me. He squealed like a hare caught in a trap. He screamed and screamed till Mrs. Broughton, almost as bewildered as myself, held on to him and coaxed him like a child to be quiet. But Broughton, and as he moved I thought that 10 minutes ago I perhaps looked as terribly ill as he did, thrust her from him, and scrambled out of the bed onto the floor, and still screaming, put out his hand to the bone. It had blood on it from my hand. He paid no attention to me whatever. In truth, I said nothing. This was a new turn indeed to the horrors of the evening. He rose from the floor with the bone in his hand and stood silent. He seemed to be listening. Time, perhaps," he muttered, and almost at the same moment fell at full length on the carpet, cutting his head against the fender. The bone flew from his hand and came to rest near the door. I picked Broughton up, haggard and broken with blood over his face. He whispered hoarsely and quickly, "Listen, listen." We listened. After 10 seconds' utter quiet, I seemed to hear something. I could not be sure, but at last there was no doubt. There was a quiet sound, as of one moving along the passage. Little regular steps came towards us over the hard oak flooring. Broughton moved to where his wife sat, white and speechless on the bed, and pressed her face into his shoulder. Then, the last thing that I could see as he turned the light out, he fell forward with his own head pressed into the pillow of the bed. Something in their company, something in their cowardice helped me, and I faced the open doorway of the room, which was outlined fairly clearly against the dimly lighted passage. I put out one hand and touched Mrs. Broughton's shoulder in the darkness. But at the last moment, I too failed. I sank on my knees and put my face in the bed. Only we all heard. The footsteps came to the door, and there they stopped. The piece of bone was lying a yard inside the room. There was a rustle of moving stuff, and the thing was in the room. Mrs. Broughton was silent. I could hear Broughton's voice praying, muffled in the pillow. I was cursing my own cowardice. Then the steps moved out again on the oak boards of the passage, and I heard the sounds dying away. In a flash of remorse, I went to the door and looked out. At the end of the corridor, I thought I saw something that moved away. A moment later, the passage was empty. I stood with my forehead against the jamb of the door, almost physically sick. You can turn the light on," I said, and there was an answering flare. There was no bone at my feet. Mrs. Broughton had fainted. Broughton was almost useless, and it took me 10 minutes to bring her to. Broughton only said one such thing worth remembering. For the most part he went on muttering prayers, but I was glad afterwards to recollect that he had said that thing. He said in a colourless voice, half as a question, half as a reproach, "You didn't speak to her." We spent the remainder of the night together. Mrs. Broughton actually fell off into a kind of sleep before dawn, but she suffered so horribly in her dreams that I shook her to consciousness again. Never was dawn so long in coming. 3 or 4 times Broughton spoke to himself. Mrs. Broughton would just then tighten her hold on his arm, but she could say nothing. As for me, I can honestly say that I grew worse as the hours passed and the light strengthened. The two violent reactions had battered down my steadiness of view, and I felt that the foundations of my life had been built upon the sand. I said nothing, and after binding up my hand with a towel, I didn't move. It was better so. They helped me, and I helped them, and we all three knew that our reason had gone very near to ruin that night. At last, when the light came in pretty strongly, and the birds outside were chattering and singing, we felt that we must do something, yet we never moved. You might have thought that we should particularly dislike being found as we were by the servants, yet nothing of that kind mattered a straw, and an overpowering listlessness bound us as we sat, until Chapman, Broughton's man, actually knocked and opened the door. None of us moved. Broughton, speaking hardly and stiffly, said, "Chapman, you can come back in 5 minutes." Chapman was a discreet man, but it would have made no difference to us if he had carried his news to the room at once. We looked at each other, and I said I must go back. I meant to wait outside till Chapman returned. I simply dared not re-enter my bedroom alone. Broughton roused himself and said that he would come with me. Mrs. Broughton agreed to remain in her own room for 5 minutes if the blinds were drawn up and all the doors left open. So Broughton and I, leaning stiffly, one against the other, went down to my room. By the morning light that filtered past the blinds we could see our way, and I released the blinds. There was nothing wrong in the room from end to end, except smears of my own blood on the end of the bed, on the sofa, and on the carpet, where I had torn the thing to pieces. Colvin had finished his story. There was nothing to say. 7 bells stuttered out from the forecastle, and the answering cry wailed through the darkness. I took him downstairs. Of course, I'm much better now, but it is a kindness of you to let me sleep in your cabin.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
So this is the part of the podcast when I talk about the story. If you're new to this podcast, I do this every episode. I will recite the story, then I'll talk about it, about the author, and give my thoughts about it and my response to the story. Now, I know that some people don't like that, just want to hear stories. So I have created long playlists on YouTube that are just compilations of stories for hours and hours. There's also a playlist called Full Audio Books, and many of these are 8 to 9 hours long. So you can get lots of stories with no commentaries there if that is your preference. If you do enjoy, and I know many of you do enjoy reflecting upon the story along with me, then please stay along for the ride. Remember, if you have the wherewithal and you don't like ads, you can become a patron, and I think for $5 a month you can get the whole library, which I keep on my Google Drive, and you can download that and you can do what you like with the stories, and there's no ads on those. There are commentaries on them. So the solution for people who don't like commentaries is the compilation playlists. The solution for people who don't like ads is become a patron. So www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud. Now we'll talk about this story, Thurnley Abbey by Percival Landon. To put the author into his context, he was an English writer, traveller and journalist, born on March 29th, 1869 in Hastings in Kent. Is Hastings in Kent? Oh, just, you know what, there's those things, you doubt yourself, don't you? I think it is. It might be in Sussex, but I think it's in Kent. Somebody's going to tell me. He was educated at Forest School and Hertford College, Oxford, where he developed a lifelong interest in heraldry and served as the secretary of the Oxford Union, which is the great debating body, of course. So the heraldry is interesting because he actually references it in this story, doesn't he? He talks about his man Colvin, and he talks about the abbey with these heraldic beasts on the pillars as you go in, and clearly he couldn't help himself, but just give a little mensch to something he's interested in. I do that in my own stories as well. So after university, Landon was called to the bar, so became barrister by the Inner Temple at the Inner Temple, and soon transitioned to journalism. So he spent all that money and then decided to become a journalist. I'm not sure anybody would do that these days. He gained prominence as a war correspondent for the Times during the South African War, and later travelled extensively in the Middle East and Central Asia, including participating in the British expedition to Tibet 1903-1904, which he documented in his well-known non-fiction work, The Opening of Tibet. Landon also penned a collection of short stories titled Raw Edges, which includes his most celebrated and frequently... Excuse me. So what's happening here is I do interject some real life things into these commentaries sometimes, and I know a lot of people really like that, so I keep doing it. If you're not one of those people, I'm really sorry, but you can't please everybody, can you? So that's the dogs. And what's happened has been I record the story with them not here, and they're locked away, and then I feel really guilty because they're downstairs, and so I open the door and they come up. And little Callie has been up here being a very good girl, and then Jasper's come up. He's been asleep, and he is now woken up and full of life, and he's annoying her. And she's very upset with him. And then Ruby's come and just pack it. This is dogs for you. So it's his own fault. He's annoying her. So Jasper is now frightened and he's sitting with me, so his sister can't get him. And I might have to have a little break to sort this out. No, he's worried about he's coming to cuddle against me. You leave him alone now. I know he annoyed you, but... You've made your point, okay? You've made your point, Callie, okay? There we are. We appear to have some kind of truce now. So we've been out for about 4.5 miles this morning, and we'll be going out later on. It's a bit too hot at the moment. It's amazing to say that, isn't it? I mean, I'm only talking about it's about 24 degrees, which is no big deal for most countries. 24 degrees centigrade. I don't know what that is in American. 60-something, I think. I actually don't know. But there we are. So you would have thought they've had us sleep since we've come in, and I took that time to record Thurnley Abbey. Now, because it's sunny outside and this room's really hot, I've had the windows open. And I don't know if you've heard, there's been young lads on motorbikes outside because there's a park behind us. And so they're taking advantage of the nice weather. And you may have heard that in the recording, motorbikes. And I almost despaired of finishing it because they kept doing it. I had to stop loads of times. I was almost at the point of going out and throwing eggs at them and telling them to jolly well clear off. They don't talk like that around here, mind, so they wouldn't know what I was talking about. But yeah, so we got there in the end, and I hope it's not too audible. I'm sorry for that interjection. I know some of you quite like these real life things. So yeah, so where were we? He died when he was 58. This is Percival Landon. He was clearly a great imperialist. He was a son of the British Empire, and he was a big close pal of Rudyard Kipling. So Thurnley Abbey was first published in 1908 as part of his only collection of short stories, which was called Raw Edges. Good title. The story quickly distinguished itself as a standout piece within the volume, revered for its chilling atmosphere and psychological depth. It was met with acclaim and found resonance with readers and fellow writers alike, and even the master of ghost stories, M.R. James, described it as almost too horrid. So that's great praise indeed. Although M.R. James elsewhere doesn't like nasty ghosts. He doesn't like vulgar ghosts, I don't think. But there we are. So it's a canon. I've never done it before. When you check on YouTube, which I inevitably do once I've decided to record it, you see 1,400 people have done it. But I wanted to do it, and so I did. What is it about it? So I think, what can we say that's familiar? First of all, this frame story idea is such a staple of late Victorian and early Edwardian ghost stories. You meet somebody who tells you a ghost story, and I believe this is a deliberate technique, which to us these days seems redundant. Why do that? But I think there was a feeling, and probably if they'd gone to creative writing classes in their day, they would have been told to do this. M.R. James himself says, create distance between we've got to remember that the late 19th century and early 20th century were hyper-realist, hyper-rationalist. You know, it seemed that science was going to show that everything was living in this mechanistic, unspiritual worldview. And although religion, particularly in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland, was still strong, I mean, we're going to leave Ireland out of that, and maybe leave Wales out of that. Yeah, I think Scotland and England was still strong, and it was waning. And so realism and physics and all this Newtonian physics, this is before Einstein, before quantum theory, before the ghost came back into the machine. It was just like we were living in this machine, and the ghosts weren't really real, were they? And, you know, clever people in the upper echelons of society, kind of who read books, people who read books. Although we've also spoken about Varney, and which is slightly earlier, obviously, about 60 years earlier, and the literate working classes. But these kind of stories were written for middle class people with leisure. You know, this is not a criticism; it's just a vague description. So they have to, M.R. James says, create distance so it becomes more believable. I remember Tolkien writing a little bit later than this, talks about the suspension of disbelief, as if your average reader isn't going to believe this at all. I think we've moved on tremendously. I think our storytelling is so saturated with fantasy and science fiction and horror that realist stories are actually in the minority. Usually they're crime stories, actually, realist stories, but we've abandoned that. But for them, and this is a long way of saying it, this frame device was probably seen as necessary to create the distance so the story became a little bit more believable. After saying that, I particularly liked, and I wondered if it was drawn from his own experience, this, you know, you're going to go to Brindisi, you're going to the east, as you always do, and you're going to catch the train across Europe, and you're going to lounge around reading novels on the Ottoman Express, and what's it called? The Orient Express, and doesn't that sound super cool? And you catch the mail boat from Brindisi, and it's the Osiris, and it's going to drop you in Egypt, and from there you're going to make your way to the east, and it sounds really cool. And I've just opened a can of worms there. Some people are going, oh, colonizers. Oh, I'm not even talking about that, okay? I'm just talking about the individual. How can you just talk about the individual? No, I am. I really am. I realise if there's some people asleep there, they've just woken up. Well, their dogs probably woke them up, to be fair. So I thought it was cool. I like that life, which is not ours. It's so romantic and leisured, and it's not ours, is it? We go to work and have to make ends meet in the cost of living crisis. But, you know, they could do that, lounge on the Orient Express as it travelled across Europe, reading yellowed paperback and sitting in the dining cars, talking to gentlemen who were members of White's Club. How splendid. Anyway, I got lost in the frame. And then the real story is also at a distance. It's a friend of his. I mean, he is the protagonist, Colvin. He experiences these things. So the Abbey itself, your classic Gothic. Let's bring it in, the classic Gothic edifice. It's like something from the Castle of Otranto, isn't it? Walled up nuns, come on. This is pure 1790 Gothic, and no worse for that. I like me a dollop of Gothic. So I think, and so Landon does that really well. One thing I want to say is that in early ghost literature, think about M.R. James, or Edwardian ghost literature and earlier stuff, Mrs. Gaskell, and, you know, what we have is the ghosts appear and there is no real physical interaction. They are scary, but, you know, you don't really touch them. You don't fight them. And so I thought this was rather special and very modern, because, of course, later on, this idea of fighting, if you were going to write a book now, and you had a ghost in it that you fought, it becomes a Dungeons and Dragons story. It becomes a fantasy story, doesn't it? At best, a Call of Cthulhu story. You know, you are going to be blasting away on punching and shooting and stuff. It's a different genre altogether now. And in modern horror, as modern horror came on, the ghosts became more physical, or the monsters became more physical and could do you physical harm. Whereas in earlier stories, generally they just did you psychological harm. They were scary, you know? And I think in early days, they weren't even psychological. They were just scary. And then we get the M.R. James psychological era from Turn of the Screw, not M.R. James, Henry James, from the Turn of the Screw. And then we get like modern horror. And this evolves into sort of Books of Blood, Clive Barker type stuff in late 20th century. So I think it's a very interesting evolution. And I think this is in the fact he actually batters the skeleton. And it's visceral, it's physical, is fresh and new. That's what I think. And would have been seen and felt as such. And I think probably that's one of the reasons why this has resonated. Why has this story resonated? So I can only examine my own feelings towards it. And I said I really did like the idea of this meeting, you know, the travel across Europe, this very gentrified, leisured life that we would have liked to lead, you know. That's nice. It's like the Shire in Lord of the Rings, isn't it? Or Lorien. They're lovely places we'd like to visit. This is a life we'd like to visit. Forget the horror. This is so that's number one. The second is the gothicness of the Abbey. If you like this kind of story, probably you like a bit of gothic like me. You may even dress in black and wear heavy makeup and have a skull on your bedside table and drink red wine out of crystal goblets. You may be full goth. You may go to Whitby Goth Weekend. And why not? That's always appealed to me, but I've been a bit scared of the full dress up in case I look vaguely ludicrous, which possibly I might. The closest I got to being a goth was going to see Fields of the Nephilim in Brixton in the 80s when I dyed my hair black. And it was pretty black anyway. It went sort of blue-black. I told this story before and everybody laughed at me at work, and they only told me when it had grown out how everybody was stifling their laughter behind their hands in the office canteen. But so I think the gothic of the Abbey, I think the nice life that they lead, and then I think the other thing that he does really well. I thought it was really well written. I thought technically the prose was very good. This is a man he's a journalist as well. This is a man who knew how to deploy his language. But the appearance and particularly the approach of the nun to collect her broken skull that has gone missing, and he absolutely scandalously takes it with him. She does not like that. She comes, and the sense of her being outside in the corridor, the sense of her in the dark coming in. I've got to admit, if you listen to my own stories, I make extensive use of that. In my stories, there's lots of people sitting in rooms where something approaches from outside, and it is a really effective technique. And if you draw it out, sometimes people say to me, will you have a look at this story? And remember, I'm not an expert in these things. I'm a practitioner, and I'm a reader and a practitioner of writing. I'm not saying, you know, I'm clearly not being honoured with many awards and stuff like that. So I'm just saying what I think. Okay, with that said, people say to me, what do you think? And very often what writers do who show me their work is they don't milk it. So, you know, it's almost like they're embarrassed. If you have there's some kind of rule of thumb, the more important a scene is, the more words you should spend on it. So if you want to create this build-up of dread, you need to spend your words rather than rushing over it. It's like, you know, and the figure approached from outside and they opened the door and there it was, and he picked up the skull and went away. No. The steps, the dread, milk it. It works. There are technical things that work, and you may think that this is a whole different ballgame, isn't it, about artifice. There is artifice in writing, and there's technicality, same way as there's a technicality to building a wall, or there's technicality to composing music, there's technicality to dance, there's technicality to painting. You know, of course there's technicality to writing. I think, again, you'll have heard me go on about this. We had this idea that the Romantics come up with in the sort of late 18th, 19th centuries, whereby we produce from the muse, from inspiration, and we just past what comes up through us, and no artifice, and that kind of sullies it, and it is ungentlemanly. It is the amateur, not the professional. There's this dichotomy that we have between the two, whereby, particularly, you know, in those days, there was the tradesman was looked down on. The gentleman, the Byronesque gentleman who spoke from his heart and his spirit and was a free spirit, that was prized, and technicalities were frowned upon, sneered at, actually. But let's get away from that. We're not living in 1880 now, or 1860, or even 1920. What we have now is, there are ways of writing things that are effective, and study rhetoric. Do it. Learn how to write that way. This guy knew how to do it. He was a professional, and I think so. In summary, those are the elements that make this a memorable story. Remember, that's my opinion. I am not special. I just read and write ghost stories, and so I'm interested in them, and that's the level I'm giving you this talk on. I don't pretend to be any greater than that. So, but if you enjoy it, and many of you do, that helps me, because it helps me earn a living, and that's fantastic. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was a goodie. It was a real goodie, part of the canon. Should have done it ages ago.